Klein held his breath with his back against the wall as he faced the darkness of the corridor. What's Captain doing? What's wrong with him? Was he drinking blood? Is this a sign of him losing control? Klein's mind was a mess, incapable of effective thought. Nearly 20 seconds later, Klein clenched his teeth. With the help of the control he had over his body as a clown, he silently made his way down the stairs. Later, he then intentionally took heavier footsteps and made his way back to the door of Madame Sharon's bedroom. Klein looked in to see the captain wrapping sealed artifact 30271 with the black cloth. His expression was serious, his face clean. It was as though what Klein had seen just now was only an illusion. Glancing sideways, Klein saw nothing abnormal with Kenley's body. It was the same as it had been. He inhaled and asked, "Captain, how am I going to confirm if those servants are still asleep? I can't make an accurate judgment just based on spirit vision alone. They'll have various emotional reactions due to their dreams which will be reflected in the color of their auras." Dunn Smith fiddled with the spirit medium mirror and was silent for a few seconds. He said with a raspy voice, "I'm sorry. I forgot about that. I've made too many mistakes tonight. There's no need for you to check, I'll confirm it." He lifted his hand and pressed his glabella, then he closed his eyes, allowing formless ripples to spread towards the first floor. It was crystal clear to a nightmare if anyone was asleep or not. Klein froze when he saw this. He looked down and bit at the insides of his lips. "Captain, were you really drawing me away just now? What are you doing? Do you know what you're doing?" He abruptly turned to look at the window, only to see the crimson moon hanging high in the sky, seemingly unchanged for thousands of years. After collecting himself, Klein used the cover of picking up his tarot cards, revolver, half-top hat, and other items to closely examine the corpses of Kenley and Madame Sharon. They maintained the same look as when they died, but their skin was turning pale at a rapid rate. They also had tinges of blue and black marks. It's a little weird, they seem to be missing something. It's not something specific, but more of a feeling. Klein muttered to himself. He felt his hair stand on end due to the chilly wind blowing through the shattered window. At that moment, Dunn opened his eyes and said in a deep voice, "They're all still asleep, but some of them are close to waking up." That's good, that's good." Klein looked at the captain, not knowing what he was saying. Dunn surveyed the surroundings and said, "Clean up the scene, then get someone from the nearest police station to come over. Oh, and make a trip back to Zoutland Street and get Fry to come help out." Klein gave the captain a deep look and nodded with his teeth clenched. Okay. With Dunn's help, Klein quickly cleaned up the scene and left Madame Sharon's house through the front door. Walking through the garden and coming outside, Klein couldn't help but look back. All he saw was the silent nursery in the darkness. There was no light at all. He turned, his heart heavy. He soon located the nearest police station based on his memory. This was common knowledge to the Nighthawks. Knock. 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 Klein knocked on the steel door. Sometime later, the officer on duty passed through the courtyard with a lantern in hand. He opened the door and observed Klein suspiciously. "What's the matter?" Klein failed to force any expression. With a heavy face, he produced his documents and showed it to the police officer. "There's a serious murder case at 15 Osna Street. Immediately call for other officers to head there to help out." The police officer lifted his lantern and scrutinized the documents before putting his feet together and saluted. "Yes, sir." Having settled this, Klein headed back to Zoutland Street on a rental carriage. On the way back, he sat in the dark carriage. His thoughts were in a mess and unfocused. Kenley is dead. I remember that he was recently engaged. His parents are still alive. What was the captain doing just now? Does he crave fresh blood? Or does he have other motives? His memory is still as poor as before, without any obvious improvement. This means that he doesn't have the warning signs of losing control. But he's known about the acting method for some time now. Does the fact that his memory hasn't improved mean that there's a problem? No. It must be because the captain is still figuring out the proper way to act as a nightmare. Ellipsis. Yes, the most important reasons why Kenley died was because of sealed artifact 30271. It was the captain who gave it to him. What am I thinking? It was a logical decision back then. Ellipsis. It was also the captain who suggested using sealed artifact 30271. Calm down, I cannot make blind guesses. But I cannot wait around either, or the situation might worsen. I'll send a letter to Madame Daly later and see if she knows what this situation means. Even if she doesn't know the exact answer, she'll definitely understand the signs of danger and inform the Holy Cathedral. That way, we can smother the problem in the cradle and get the captain back to normal. No, the captain might not have a problem. I might have misunderstood something. I'll see what Madame Daly says. Klein had already made a decision when the carriage arrived at 36 Zoutland Street. He was no longer flustered and helpless as before. He went up the stairway toward the entrance of the Blackthorn Security Company with heavy steps and opened the door from a key he fished out. The familiar setting calmed him down considerably. It reminded him of how he felt when he asked the captain for help every time something was wrong. Taking a deep breath, Klein went to the recreation room and found Fry reading alone under the gas lamp. Fry turned to look at Klein, his cold face revealing a look of concern and worry. Did something happen? Where's Captain and Kenley? Klein replied with a raspy voice, Kenley's dead. He died at Madame Sharon's hands. We all made mistakes. The captain is guarding the scene. He needs your help there. Before they left, the captain had informed Fry about the general situation. He told Fry that if they weren't back within 2 hours, he was to send a telegraph to the Holy Cathedral. Similarly, since they had to apply for sealed artifact 30271 and enter Channey's Gate at night, Royale, who was guarding Channey's Gate, was also notified of the mission. According to the internal guidelines of the Nighthawks, a captain could permit the opening of Channey's Gate at night. If the captain was present, then only the captain could enter. Fry froze for a moment, then he let out a sigh. He drew a crimson moon on his chest. He put on his coat and hat and headed out the door. When he walked past Klein, he suddenly said softly, "You don't need to blame yourself. Making mistakes is something we can never avoid. We must always trust our partners." Yeah, Klein closed his eyes, his vision turning blurry. Klein and Fry first headed to the basement to notify Royale before locking the door to the Blackthorn Security Company and rushing to Madame Sharon's house. It was nearing dawn by the time they got Kenley's corpse and Madame Sharon's half-decapitated body back. Dunn stood in front of the mortuary, silently looking inside. It was some time before he turned to Klein and said, "Go home first. You just experienced an intense battle, you must be exhausted." All right. Klein didn't reject the suggestion. He puckered his lips and stole a glance at the captain before quietly leaving the Blackthorn Security Company. He took a carriage back to Daffodil Street. Just as he had done the previous time, he easily entered his bedroom and locked the door. Taking out the silver ritual dagger, Klein sealed the room with a wall of spirituality. He then sat at his desk and wrote urgently, "Dear Madame Daly, I've noticed that there's something odd about the captain recently. During a mission, he secretly..." Klein stopped when he reached this point. His mind had gone blank. He didn't know how to continue or how to describe the incident. "Pa!" He threw the pen and crumpled the piece of paper in front of him into a ball. Looking at it, he pounded heavily on the table, sending a reverberating thump across the room. Klein closed his eyes and covered his face with his hands. He didn't move, as if he had become a statue. 5 minutes later, he sighed. He put down his right hand and burned the ball of paper with his spirituality. He watched it turn to ash as it fell into the bin. After organizing his thoughts, Klein took out a fresh piece of paper and wrote, "Dear Madame Daly, we just completed a mission and regrettably lost a partner. The exact details are as follows. Back then, I felt that with my present standards, my spirit vision was incapable of accurately ascertaining whether the servants were asleep or not, and that it was very troublesome to do divinations for every one of them. Thus, I returned with the intention of asking for the captain's advice. At that moment, through the mirror's reflection, I saw the captain kneeling beside Kenley's corpse, with crimson blood covering his mouth. I'm not sure what exactly happened, nor do I know the state the captain is in. I hope that you can give me an answer. Ellipsis." After writing this, Klein read the letter again with a heavy heart before folding it in half. He then set up a ritual and activated his spirit vision to summon Daly's messenger. He summoned the strange face, which was only a mouth without any eyes or nose. He saw the red tongue laced with irregular sharp teeth and 5 pale fingers on the tip of the tongue. Klein silently handed the letter over. When everything was restored back to normal again, he sat down and continued writing. This time, he planned to ask Mr. Azek. On a recent mission, something strange happened to my superior. He sent me away and kneeled beside the corpse of a teammate. His mouth was covered in crimson blood. Have you encountered something like this in your memories before? How can I help my superior? After folding the letter, Klein took out the copper whistle, put it to his lips, and blew hard. In the silence, illusory white bones came flying up from the desk like a fountain and finally formed a huge monster. It was almost 4 meters tall, still covered in a faint glow. Its head was still poking through the ceiling, looking no different from before. Klein flicked his wrist and threw the letter. The white bone monster caught the letter and gripped it tight. Klein blew the copper whistle again and saw the messenger break into illusory white bones and fall like rain before vanishing through the surface of the desk. Klein felt much calmer after finishing everything, but he didn't stop trying. He moved the chair back and stood up. He then walked 4 steps counterclockwise and entered the world above the gray fog. The lofty palace and the ancient mottled table appeared before his eyes, as though it would stay the same for tens of thousands of years. Klein sat at the fool's seat of honor. Then, he took out the spirit pendulum from his left sleeve and conjured a yellowish-brown goatskin and a fountain pen in front of him. He wanted to divine the captain's situation that night. After some thought, Klein wrote the first divination statement. Dunn Smith's abnormality would lead me into danger. In mysticism, divination that involved any danger to the diviner was hardest to infer. It was an instinctual ability of spirituality. In other words, as long as there wasn't an extremely strong disturbance, Klein would be able to get an accurate result from the divination about his own situation. This was also the reason why he would divine if there was danger in the mission, even though he knew that Madame Sharon had the ability to interfere with divination. He also knew that Madame Sharon wasn't strong enough to affect this kind of divination. In order to determine Captain Dunn Smith's situation, he decided to eliminate all disturbances and perform the divination above the gray fog. He held the pendulum with his left hand as he recited the divination statement 7 times. He closed his eyes and entered a cogitation state. After a few seconds, he opened his eyes and they returned to their normal color. He looked at the topaz pendant, and he felt heavy-hearted because the pendulum was spinning clockwise. The rotation wasn't small, nor was the speed slow. It meant that the result was positive. It meant that Dunn Smith's abnormality would lead him to danger. And the danger level was significant. After he closed his eyes, Klein wiped away the previous content and wrote down a new divination statement. The reason for Dunn Smith's abnormality. He put away the topaz pendant and leaned back into the chair. He recited the divination statement as he entered a dream with the aid of cogitation. In the blurry illusory world, he couldn't see or discover anything. There was nothing except gray fog. That means that there was insufficient information, so the divination failed. Klein looked at the goatskin on the long bronze table as he muttered bitterly and helplessly. Suddenly, he felt a strong feeling of exhaustion. He realized that it was the result of an intense battle, continuous rituals, and multiple divinations. Klein wrapped himself up with spirituality and stimulated a rapid descent from above the gray fog and returned to reality. He had a few nightmares that night. The ending of each dream was either Kenley vomiting his organs, or Dunn Smith with crimson blood around his mouth. Ellipsis. The next morning, Klein was on duty at Channey's Gate, so he arrived early at the Blackthorn Security Company. At that very moment, Roseanne, Mrs. Oriana, and the other clerks had yet to arrive for work. Klein walked through the partition and saw the wide-open door and Dunn Smith, who was seated in the captain's office. Dunn had taken off his coat, and he only had his white shirt and black vest on. He sat in his seat while he held a cup of coffee in his hands. He was staring at the wall in front of him blankly. His hair seemed dry, his gray eyes looked dull, and his face was showing obvious signs of weariness too. Even for the captain, who's experienced many similar incidents, it's still unbearable to lose 2 teammates in such a short period of time. Klein's heart winced as the scene of the shattered full-body mirror reflecting Dunn kneeling before Kenley's corpse with his face covered in crimson blood appeared once again. Klein clenched his teeth and looked away. After nearly 20 seconds, he composed himself and extended his hand to knock on the captain's door. Knock, knock, knock. Dunn put down his coffee cup as his gray eyes became deep again. He took a deep breath and said, "I've reported the matter to the Holy Cathedral," and they gave an initial reply. The church will compensate Kenley's family with £3,000, and the police department will give £1,000 as bereavement payment. A total of £4,000. To most middle-class citizens, that's wealth that can't be earned in a lifetime. Kenley's weekly salary was £7, making an annual income of £364. Adding in any bonuses and additional income, he would make at least £380. £4,000 is equivalent to 10 years of his income. Such wealth can provide at least £200 of income a year. Although money cannot make up for the loss of Kenley, it's the only effective thing at the moment. Klein had many thoughts passing through his mind before he finally sighed. That's all we can do. The Church of the Evernight Goddess couldn't be faulted when it came to such matters. Dunn pulled his collar and said in a deep voice, "Go to the basement and take over Royale's shift." "All right." Klein nodded slightly. He turned around and walked towards the door. Then, he heard Captain add as though he was talking to himself, "We'll send Kenley home later." Send Kenley home. His father, his mother, his siblings, his fiancée, how will they react? Klein's heart tightened, and he was somehow glad that he didn't have to face such sorrow. He knew it was the mentality of an escapist, but he was really afraid of seeing the agony in the eyes of Kenley's parents, or how his fiancée would seem to lose her soul. He was afraid to see their expressions of hidden resentment and afraid of hearing their sobbing. Klein quickened his pace and hurried to Channy's gate. He completed the shift change with Royale in silence. He sat in the duty room and occasionally took out his silver pocket watch and watched the time pass by slowly. After an unknown period of time, Klein suddenly heard illusory sounds that overlapped one another. He saw the 4 black dots appear on the back of his hand and understood that it was either Justice, the hanged man, or the sun praying to him. He had no way to answer them immediately. He could only wait till the notification ended, for more prayers to come, and until the next morning when he returned home. Having just fished his keys to open the door to his house, Klein saw the maidservant Bella wiping the dining table while his sister, Melissa, who was dressed up, and his brother, Benson, came downstairs. "Didn't you just go to Mass last week?" Klein asked curiously. Benson smiled and said, "That sounds like the memory of a person who hasn't gotten any sleep the entire night." Huh? Klein looked even more confused. "Today is the first day that The Return of the Count will be releasing tickets for sale," Melissa explained. Klein smacked his forehead and took off his hat. "I've been too busy recently. I totally forgot about it. Especially these past 3 days." He added with a sigh. Melissa looked at him with concern and said, "Your breakfast is in the kitchen. Eat it and get some sleep." Benson and I thought that since we're going out, we might as well drop by St. Selena Cathedral to have Mass. All right. Klein waved and bade his brother and sister farewell. He had a simple breakfast and returned to his bedroom. After he did the preparatory work, he took 4 steps counterclockwise and entered the world above the grey fog. He saw that Justice and the hanged man's corresponding crimson stars were burgeoning and shrinking faintly. He extended his right hand and emanated his spirituality. Then, blurry images formed before Klein's eyes. Miss Justice's prayer sounded in his ears. "I pray for you to listen. Because of the Kilongos incident, my father hired a Byander to protect me. There are also others who are watching over me secretly. It wasn't easy for me to finally find an opportunity to pray to you. I would like to apply for leave from the gathering next week. I believe this will pass soon." Klein subconsciously glanced at the blurry image. The image was filled with fog, and there seemed to be a huge bathtub with rippling water. Miss Justice was wrapped in a bath towel. He retracted his gaze and started listening to the hanged man's prayer. His description was different from Justice's, but he was making the same request. He too needed to ask for leave due to the aftermath of Kilingos's death. Klein nodded slightly and responded to their prayers respectively. "I'm aware." Then, he sent a message to the Sun's Crimson Star. "The upcoming gathering will be cancelled temporarily. Ellipsis. City of Silver." Derek Berg was paying attention in the training field. The sky above his head was still dark, with occasional flashes of lightning that lit up the sky. Suddenly, his vision went blurry before he saw the thick fog and the ancient palace that looked like the home of a giant. He also saw Mr. Fool, who sat in the depths of the grey fog. "The upcoming gathering will be cancelled temporarily." His voice reverberated, but the view before Derek had already returned to normal. He wasn't shocked at such a magical incident because Mr. Fool contacted him in this manner to remind him before every gathering. Derek looked up at the woman in front of him subconsciously, a member of the City of Silver's 6-member council, Shepard Lloydia. This terrifying expert kept switching between a smile and being aloof. She told every young man at the training field that they would join the patrolling troops soon and rid the dark monsters in the vicinity. That wouldn't be training anymore. Elder Lloydia didn't notice anything strange. She seems to be getting weirder. Is it because there's a high-sequence Byander's evil spirit among the souls that she grazes? Derek thought. Klein returned to his bedroom, threw himself into bed, and quickly fell asleep. He dreamed about what had happened these past few days. Suddenly, he felt like he was being shaken by someone, and he suddenly woke up. Klein opened eyes and saw a gigantic white bone hand. The hand paused and threw the letter on the bed. Then, it vanished into thin air. Mr. Azek's reply. Klein grabbed the letter, full of hope. Klein opened the letter, feeling both expectant and nervous before he began reading Azek's reply. I thought about a few possibilities regarding the scenario you described, and I remembered a few things about vampires and mutants. Natural vampires were already on the brink of extinction before the dragons and giants bowed out of the stage of world history. Later on, they might occasionally be discovered. The vampires we usually talk about, as well as those mentioned in folklore, are more similar to Beyonders. I recall that the name of a potion in a particular pathway is called vampire. If your superior is now in a half-insane state, then it's very likely that he mistakenly consumed such a potion. The result of mixing two potions from different pathways makes a half-insane state a certainty. Yes, I vaguely remember the pathway of the Evernight, which is also the sleepless pathway as you know it, can be interchanged at high sequences with the pathway of death and the pathway of giants. But it doesn't include the vampire pathway. Of course, we cannot rule out the possibility that your superior might have accepted it willingly. After all, vampires have a long life, an exceptional constitution, and excellent looks. When compared with these benefits, accepting a state of half-insanity is reasonable. Klein froze when he read the letter. He didn't expect Mr. Azek to provide him with this much information. The death pathway is also known as the corpse collector pathway. It can be interchanged at high sequences with the sleepless pathway. I knew about this from Emperor Russell's diary. But to think that it can also be interchanged with the giant pathway after sequence 4. The giant pathway is the one that the City of Silver possesses, which is also the present-day god of combat pathway. I've always suspected that giant King Ormir was the ancient god of combat. Yes, Emperor Russell's diary described the Church of the Evernight Goddess and the Church of the God of Combat as mortal enemies. Could this be because the pathways they possess can be interchanged at higher sequences? If I follow this line of thought, I can find an explanation as to why the three ancient churches, the Church of the Lord of Storms, the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun, and the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom, are at odds with each other. That's because the pathways of Sailor, Bard, and Reader can be interchanged at high sequences. Yes, during the end of the previous epoch, the Pale Era, it's likely that the fall of death was caused by the Evernight Goddess and the God of Combat. The captain is perfectly fine usually, other than his poor memory. He doesn't show any signs of half-insanity. I can rule out the possibility of him consuming the vampire potion. Mr. Azek has recalled quite a number of things recently. Could the creeping hunger have really stimulated his memories? Klein nodded and continued reading the letter. Mutant isn't the name of a particular species. It's more like the description for many similar creatures. Under normal circumstances, they're no different from an ordinary human, but there is an innate, suppressed, twisted desire in their hearts. This desire erupts when they come into contact with a certain scene or object. They become monsters, succumbing to their desires for blood and massacre. After everything settles, they will return to normal again. They become slightly more merciless and unfeeling after each time their desires erupt. This will continue until their souls are completely twisted. The only example of this that I can recall is the werewolf. They're similar to humans for the most part, and they cannot be distinguished using most Beyonder abilities. But, during the full moon, the twisted desires in their hearts intensify, and their bodies also change accordingly. Your superior might be a potential mutant. The death of your teammate might have triggered his true nature. These are all my personal guesses. I cannot guarantee that there are no other possibilities since I haven't gotten all my memories back. Perhaps your theory of this being a precursor to losing control can also explain this. There's no saving him whether he has consumed the vampire potion, or if he's a mutant. Of course, many people have theorized that mutants were originally ordinary human beings, but were put under a strange curse or corrupted by some evil god or devil, and, thus, transform into a different monster under certain circumstances. Also, I'm not too sure if you can treat him when you notice the warning signs of losing control. I would advise that you report this directly to your superior's superior and hope that there's still time. Klein looked gravely at the desk after placing the letter down. He slipped into deep thought. He had to admit that the theory of a mutant was a very possible one, but he couldn't eliminate the possibility that it was a warning sign to him losing control. All I can do is wait for Madame Daly's reply. I sent the letter 2 nights ago, so she should have received the letter yesterday morning. If she replied immediately, I should have seen the letter last night or this morning. It's almost noon. Does that messenger not dare to go near Channy's gate? Or was Madame Daly held up by something? Klein shook his head. He still felt exhausted and used cogitation to force himself to sleep. In the hazy world, Klein was suddenly jolted to his senses. He knew that he was dreaming. He then saw Dunn Smith in his black windbreaker appear in front of him. Responding in a manner congruent with a normal dream, Klein gave a delayed greeting, "Good morning, Captain." Dunn nodded slightly and said, "Leonard found a clue when he was investigating the Lenivas case. He needs your help. The mystery prior that the Holy Cathedral sent over won't arrive until tomorrow morning because of a train fault." "All right," Klein replied in a fleeting voice. Dunn thought for a moment before adding, "There's no need for you to return to Zoutland Street. Head to 62 Howe Street directly. Leonard will be there waiting for you. It's been hard on you." The moment he finished his sentence, Klein's dream shattered. Klein instinctively opened his eyes. Howe Street. Isn't that the area where the Divination Club, my classmate Welch, and the member of the Aurora Order lived? There sure are many incidents lately, one after another, as if they're culminating in something. Klein thought as he got up slowly. He washed up in the bathroom before changing into a white shirt, brown vest, and black windbreaker. He then picked up his hat and went down to the living room. It wasn't 11 yet, and Benson and Melissa hadn't returned home. Klein informed Bella that he was going out and that she didn't need to prepare lunch for him. He then took a public carriage to Howe Street and saw the messy-haired midnight poet, Leonard Mitchell, whose hair exuded beauty, waiting for him in at Building 62. Leonard was still in a thin white shirt despite the chilly September weather. He had paired it with beige pants. He swept his green eyes at Klein. This might be the building rented by Lenivas under a false name. "How did you figure it out?" Klein asked out of curiosity. Leonard pointed to his head. "Since you found a clue from Hood Eugen and suspected that Lenivas was likely connected to that member of the Aurora Order, the cloth merchant Sirius Arapis, I had to change my line of thinking after my normal investigations revealed nothing. I started investigating the Aurora Order. The previous report told me that Sirius had interactions with many of the residents on Howe Street, so I searched every one of them and found a problem with this one." "What problem?" Klein asked. Leonard raised his brows. "An obvious problem. The guest here appears very rarely. He claimed to be going to the southern continent to do business after Hannes Vincent's death and never returned. His records are very realistic, and the police didn't discover anything. This could only be a coincidence." Klein creased his brows. "Of course, a coincidence. But when I showed the residents around here Lenivas's picture, an old man felt that he looked similar to the resident at number 62, other than his different glasses." Leonard took out a black and white photograph from his pocket. "Why didn't you say so earlier?" Klein lampooned inwardly. He entered 62 Howe Street with Leonard, and at Leonard's request, he started to divine if there were any hidden compartments or secret chambers. The result was yes, the secret chamber or hidden compartment in this building. Klein wrote down another divination statement. He took a seat on the sofa and closed his eyes as he recited the statement. 7 times later, he entered a dream. His vision was blurry. In the blurry world, Klein saw a wooden bookshelf. He saw rows upon rows of books. He saw that one of the books had been taken away. He saw the wooden surface beside the book open, revealing a hidden compartment. The scene quickly disappeared as Klein opened his eyes and told Leonard, in the study. Klein wound the topaz pendulum around his wrist and followed Leonard into the study. He saw the wooden bookshelf he had seen in his dream. "Pull out that book, the place it's covering has a hidden compartment." Klein pointed at the book nearest to the sides. "So it's here. I couldn't find anything when I searched the place, and I had no choice but to return to Zoutland Street to request for help," Leonard grumbled as he walked over. He pulled out the book Klein had pointed out. After searching the area, he finally found the mechanism to open the hidden compartment. A letter lay silently in the hidden compartment. A letter? Lenivas hid a letter here? Klein found it extremely strange. After he divined to see if there was anything dangerous within the letter and received a negative answer, Leonard picked up the letter and opened the unmarked envelope. Leonard pulled out the letter within and unfolded it. Klein leaned forward to get a look of its contents. All he saw were the first few paragraphs of the letter. "Ha ha ha, congratulations. Congratulations on finally finding this letter. This means that you're not too stupid, nor too slow. You qualify to take part in this game of life and death that I've designed. Child laborers that die before their time. Factory workers who seldom live past 10 years after entering the factory because of their working conditions. Female workers who risk severe illnesses for a meager salary. I see boundless resentment surrounding every factory, turning the surroundings oppressive and gloomy. This is the worst of times, and also the best of times. Our game shall take place under such a setting. Fools, prepare yourselves, I'm going to issue you a hint. Klein and Leonard lifted their gaze from the letter and exchanged glances. They muttered, "He's crazy, right? Lenivus is secretly a lunatic? A lunatic who truly has a delusional disorder and an antisocial personality." Klein thought and felt a tug at his heartstrings. He quickly redirected his gaze to the letter. "Ladies and gentlemen, the hint is that I've placed a bomb in Tingen, a bomb that will grow stronger over time. Seek it and finish it before it explodes. If you lose the game, there will be a boom, and the entire city of Tingen will be reduced to a ruin. Trust me, I'm not lying at all about this. Lenivus, who enjoys giving his friends pleasant surprises." "A bomb?" Klein looked at Leonard and muttered to himself, perplexed. Leonard held the letter up to the sunlight and looked as he flipped it around. He didn't find any other clues. The term bomb is probably an expression. I've never heard of a bomb that can grow stronger. Klein creased his eyebrows and said thoughtfully, "No, I mean, he might be using bomb to reference something in mysticism, such as an evil ritual that continuously accumulates power." Leonard cocked his head as though he was listening to something when suddenly, his facial expression grew solemn. He nodded as his green eyes constricted. "Maybe you're right. Isn't there a description at the beginning of the letter? Child laborers that die before their time, factory workers who seldom live past 10 years after entering the factory because of their working conditions, female workers who risk severe illnesses for a meager salary. Boundless resentment surrounding every factory. Perhaps that might be the energy source that constantly strengthens Lenivus's bomb." "Yes, that's very possible." Klein suddenly tensed up and said, "We need to report to the captain immediately." Leonard laughed and said, "There's no need to be so nervous. You should know that Lenivus is a swindler. The part where he said that he didn't lie might be a lie itself. Of course, regardless, we have to return to Zoutland Street to report to the captain. It's best if we can request the Holy Cathedral to send a mysticism expert over and find the location of the altar through the abnormal accumulation of resentment. Someone is apparently very familiar with protocol. But why would the setup of such an altar need Hood Eugen's help? What role does a psychiatrist play in this?" Klein didn't object to the idea. He left 62 Howe Street with Leonard and rushed back to Zoutland Street on a hired carriage. Just as they entered the Blackthorn Security Company's door, Klein saw two familiar faces, one voluptuous and one scrawny. They were Maynard's wife and sister. They were still in black dresses and black hats. The fine checkered black gauze concealed their faces. The two ladies were chatting with Roseanne, and when they suddenly saw Klein's return, they turned around and walked forward. "You really are the cream of the crop in this industry, Mrs." Maynard nodded slightly and said in a low voice, "I'm very pleased with the outcome and am also impressed with your work approach. Here's the reward that you deserve." The scrawny woman passed a light brown paper bag to Klein. It was filled with thick stacks of cash. There were £10 notes, £5 notes, £1 notes, and also 5 soldi and 1 soldi. "It's a total of £230, the scrawny lady stated simply. Klein was in no mood to pay any attention to the money. He passed it to Roseanne and said, "Take this to Mrs. Oriana." I doubt the two respectable women would make a mistake counting the money. At that moment, the corner of his eyes caught the Tingen City Honest paper in Mrs. Maynard's hands. On the most eye-catching spot on the front page, there were two pieces of news. Old Baron's widow dies in involvement with MP Maynard's murder. Mayor Dennis takes the blame for the worsening public security in Tingen for the past 3 months and resigns. So that's the official excuse for Madame Sharon's case? I've yet to read the newspaper today. Klein nodded at the two ladies and followed Leonard through the partition to the captain's office. "How was it? Did you find any clues?" Dunn Smith closed his document, lifted his head, and looked at Klein and Leonard with his deep grey eyes. "We found a letter that was left behind by Lenivus." Leonard didn't provide any further descriptions and simply passed the captain the letter filled with madness and provocation. Dunn opened the letter and scanned through it quickly. He rubbed his temples as he said, "He really is a lunatic. He's only a sequence 8, sequence 7 at most." Klein agreed from the bottom of his heart. Lenivus is a dangerous figure who can damage the stability of social order. Even though he's weak, we can't belittle him. Then, he told Captain about his and Leonard's assumption. Dunn touched his receding hairline as he said, "That was my thought as well. I'll immediately send a telegram to the Holy Cathedral and ask them to send a mysticism expert over for assistance. Who knows how dangerous Lenivus's bomb could be? We have to be extremely careful. When the Holy Cathedral replies to me, I'll arrange for the follow-up." Klein and Leonard exchanged glances and nodded simultaneously as they said, "All right." Seizing the moment when Captain was sending a telegram to the Holy Cathedral, Klein returned to the reception hall to grab a copy of the Tingen City Honest paper from Roseanne. He stood at the partition and read the 2 articles with full concentration. The widow of the old baron of the Coy family, Madame Sharon, was suspected to be involved in the sudden death of Member of Parliament Maynard. The police received a tip and took action at night. They discovered that Madame Sharon and her accomplice had knocked out her servants to carry out a pagan ceremony in her bedroom. They refused to surrender and attempted to resist arrest, resulting in the death of a heroic police officer. Finally, Madame Sharon and her accomplice paid the price for their evil deeds with their lives. Mayor Dennis takes the blame for the worsening public security in Tingen and resigns. He also announced that he wouldn't be running for re-election next year. For the next few months, Deputy Mayor Mr. Harry will take on the responsibilities of mayor. Ellipsis. A heroic police officer. Is that the description of Kenley? Klein sighed and knew that it was the best way of handling the situation. According to the internal rules of the Nighthawks, in order to prevent the forces of evil from taking revenge on their family members, their names would be kept confidential even if they sacrificed their lives. He folded the newspaper quietly and returned it to the reception desk. Klein suddenly saw a visitor who walked through the entrance. She was a young lady, in her 20s at most. She was in a ruffled hat and loose dress. She had lovely facial features, blonde hair, green eyes, and also a depressed yet silent temperament. She was quite a beauty. The most eye-catching thing about her was her stomach that bulged out. She looked like she was more than 7 months pregnant. Klein was stunned, and he felt that he had seen the young pregnant lady before. Suddenly, he heard Leonard say in surprise, "Miss Megos?" "Megos? Yes, the young lady who was conned by Lenivus. She's pregnant with Lenivus's child, and as such, there might be something wrong with her mental health. She says her child sings in her stomach and also whistles." Klein was suddenly enlightened and he wasn't surprised that Leonard knew Megos. When they relaunched the investigations of people related to Lenivus, the lady's photo had been seen by every Nighthawk. Klein knew her even earlier. Her aunt Christina, whose savings had been conned by Lenivus, had brought her to the divination club to ask for help. Her aunt even asked if the child in her stomach could be used for divination. Then, as Megos heard Leonard's voice, she looked over at the both of them vacantly and replied politely, "Hello. Miss Megos, what brings you here to the Blackthorn Security Company? Do you have anything that you'd like us to do for you?" Klein took 2 steps forward and asked. He was very confused by Megos's sudden visit. He felt it was an extreme coincidence. "We just found Lenivus's letter, and Megos comes visiting?" Megos touched her stomach and smiled faintly. "Somehow or other, I suddenly thought of coming to Zoutland Street and suddenly thought of coming up to take a look. Her mental health seems to have worsened." Klein recalled that he hadn't managed to activate his spirit vision and check on Megos' situation previously. Hence, he lifted his teeth and was about to tap his left molars. Just then, a series of thoughts screamed through his head in increasing intensity. "Don't look. Don't look. Don't look. You'll die. You'll die if you look. You'll die if you look." Klein stood rooted on the spot like a statue as his forehead was covered in cold sweat. It was like having a deep and heavy nightmare that he nearly couldn't wake up from. Suddenly, he understood something. He had failed to activate his spirit vision the last time because his spirituality had noticed an unimaginable danger. It slowed him down subconsciously, so he missed the opportunity and forgot the follow-up. At that point, Klein had yet to digest the seer potion entirely, and he had yet to advance to sequence 8, so the warnings of spirituality were very subtle and difficult to notice. But now, Clown's spiritual foresight was so clear and obvious. After nearly 20 seconds, Klein finally shook off his paralysis. He looked sideways at Leonard and realized that the midnight poet was also covered in cold sweat, and his eyes were filled with horror. Suddenly, Klein understood what the bomb Lenivus was referring to. It's the baby in Megos' stomach. It's the baby that he left behind. Klein suddenly associated the description in the letter with Hood Eugen's answers, and he suddenly remembered something that he read in Emperor Russell's diary. "I started the Industrial Revolution with my own hands and personally ushered in the age of steam and machinery, but this will only become the hotbed for the descent of an evil god upon this world?" Klein's pupils constricted as he thought of a possibility that he instinctually refused to admit. "No, that's not right. The baby in Megos' stomach can't be the son of some evil god or an evil god waiting to descend upon the world. No, why would Hood Eugen do such a silly thing? Although his psychiatrist power can help Lenivus fool Megos and use her as a spawning vessel in her semi-unconscious state. No, the resentment of child laborers that die before their time, and the factory workers and female workers who live less than 10 years aren't helping the son of an evil god to grow rapidly. No, why you may not look directly at God. Klein instinctively reached for his pockets. He held the flaring sun charm in one hand and Azek's copper whistle in the other. He acutely noticed that the cold, gentle Byander feedback of the latter had vanished as if it was being suppressed by an invisible power. However, the former was still warm and comforting. Making use of this comforting feeling, Klein entered a half-cogitation state. He blocked out his feelings of worry and didn't leave anything to chance. He turned and shot a look at Leonard Mitchell, then tipped his chin toward Megos. He then controlled his expression with his clown abilities and smiled at Megos. Do you want coffee, black tea, or nothing at all? Megos stroked her stomach as if she was listening to something. A cup of warm water. I suddenly thought of chatting with you guys about Lenivis. I have the feeling that you know a lot. Who told you that? Leonard was no longer the frivolous guy that he usually was. His smile had turned rather stiff. Megos suddenly giggled. My child told me. He knows a lot. He's very smart. Klein fought back the urge to curse. He turned to the partition and signaled to Leonard to keep Megos calm. Leonard forced a smile and pointed toward the sofa. That's exactly what I'd like to talk about. We want to have a chat with you about Lenivis. Behind the receptionist desk, Roseanne looked on in confusion. She suddenly realized that she didn't need to do anything. Klein quickly made his way past the partition and directly pushed open the door to Dunsmith's office, then closed the door with a bang. He saw Dunn looking shocked before turning serious and saying in a heavy voice, Captain, something serious has happened. I know what Lenivis meant by bomb. Dunn stood up and pointed outside. Megos? He had obviously heard Leonard's shocked exclamation, but he was unable to see the looks of fear and cold sweat on his teammates' faces. Klein nodded and explained quickly, I tried to activate my spirit vision to observe Megos to ascertain her mental condition, but my spirituality stopped me from making the attempt. It kept warning me not to look, that I would die if I did so. This made me recall a saying, you may not look directly at God. Even if the fetus in Megos' stomach isn't an evil god attempting to descend upon this world, or the spawn of an evil god, it's definitely a legendary creature. Captain, connecting this to the Black Altar in Hood Eugen's memories, to his psychiatrist abilities, to the tragic world as described in Lenivis's letter, I think that my guess is quite close to the truth. Lenivis obtained a ritualistic magic linked to the true creator from an Aurora Order member. With Hood Eugen's help, he turned Megos into a vessel to gestate a certain power. Then, this power will make use of the resentment, oppression, and gloominess surrounding the factories to quickly grow until maturity. In other words, the ritual itself needs this resentment, oppression, and gloominess in order to succeed. Dunn considered Klein's words seriously for nearly 20 seconds before nodding with a solemn expression. I'll ask for assistance from the Holy Cathedral immediately. Let's hope that the baby in Megos' stomach can still wait. Of course, we can't just sit back and do nothing. Tell Leonard to keep Megos calm and keep her company. Notify Mrs. Oriana, Roseanne, and the rest. Get all the non-combatants to evacuate. I'll head to the back of Channy's Gate after I send the telegram. We have to prepare for the worst, which is if Megos' baby is born before the arrival of reinforcements from the Holy Cathedral. As captain of the Tingen Nighthawks, I have the authority to use St. Selena's ashes during emergencies. St. Selena's ashes. The ashes of a high-sequence Byander. The core seals within Channy's Gate. Klein's worries eased a little. He quickly thought of other things. Captain, we can also ask for reinforcements from the mandated Punishers and the Machinery Hivemind. They should have similar holy items. Klein suddenly had a stroke of inspiration as he muttered to himself, Lenivis's case was originally under the purview of the mandated Punishers. Old Neil and I were there to help when one of their senior members lost control. As he spoke softly, his voice grew to a crescendo. Captain, can you ask the mandated Punishers if the member who lost control was tracking or keeping Megos under surveillance? Are you suspecting that he lost control because he got corrupted by the baby in Megos' stomach? They were responsible for Megos when the investigation was happening. Dunn answered seriously. We cannot delay any further. Go to Mrs. Oriana and the rest. I'll take this time to send a telegram to first ask for assistance from the Holy Cathedral, then I'll inform the mandated Punishers and the Machinery Hivemind. Yes, I'll also have to send a telegram to the police department and see if they can come up with an excuse to evacuate the citizens nearby. All right. Klein had taken a few steps out of the room when he suddenly recalled something. He thought about the coincidence of Migos' sudden visit. The image of the building with the red chimney appeared in his mind. He turned around quickly and said to Dunn, "Captain, one more thing. Do you remember the coincidences I told you about? The clue to the Antigonus family's notebook in the house opposite the kidnapping, Ray Bieber who didn't make it out of Tingen in time, Hannes Vincent exposing himself because of a coincidence, and how a member of the Aurora Order lost his life because he chanced upon me, etc. All these coincidences are very subtle and hard to detect, but the fact that Megos suddenly came looking for us right after we discovered Lenivas's letter is too obvious and direct. This coincidence was already laid bare before us, it's no longer hidden. I think that the person behind this will soon take center stage. Also, why would Madame Sharon take the risk in killing Member of Parliament Maynard? Is this also a coincidence? Dunn thought about it and gave a solemn reply, I'll include this point in the telegram. Klein didn't waste any more time. He exited the office and went straight for the accountant's room on the opposite side. Mrs. Oriana was preparing the budget for the last 3 months of the year. She wanted to complete it in advance just in case the captain forgot about it again. When she saw Klein enter, she greeted him with a smile. Lad, what claims do you have to submit today? Klein exhaled. Mrs. Oriana, we will be on vacation today. Go back home immediately. Oriana froze for a while, looking at the serious face before her in a daze. A few seconds later, she stood up in a fluster. All right, Klein added in a hurry, help me inform the rest of the clerks in the office and the armory. I'll inform Roseanne. Yes. Oriana didn't even pack. She grabbed her handbag and hurried out of the accounting office. She turned and stared at Klein after entering the corridor. She drew a crimson moon near her chest and said, all of you will be blessed by the goddess. Thank you, Klein replied in silence. He made his way past the partition into the receptionist area only to see Leonard chatting with Megos about Lenivas, his expression rigid. Klein leaned toward Roseanne as he filled up a cup of warm water. He then whispered, go home, it's dangerous here. Come back tomorrow. Roseanne opened her mouth in shock but closed it again after seeing Klein's stern expression. She lowered her head and packed for about 10 seconds before picking up her bag and leaving the receptionist area. Just as she was walking past Klein, she bit on her lip and whispered, to be honest, I respect the Nighthawks as much as I hate other people who become Beyonders. After seeing the clerks evacuate the Blackthorn Security Company, Klein brought warm water to Megos, bent his back, and placed it on the table in front of her. I have something to settle, I'll be back soon. As he stood up, he took the opportunity to lean in towards Leonard's ear and whispered, keep her here. Leonard clenched his teeth and widened his mouth into a grin. He continued his conversation with Megos and noticed that Megos was getting a little restless, as though she was losing her focus. Klein returned to the captain's office, only to realize that Dunn had already gone underground. There was a telegram on the table. It was the reply from the mandated punishers. Yes. We will be there immediately. Yes. The mandated punisher did lose control because of Megos. Klein couldn't calm himself down as he made his way to the corridor. He didn't know if he was waiting for the captain to retrieve the holy ashes or for reinforcements to arrive. I wonder if high-sequence Beyonders can teleport. I don't think so. He paced around a few times, suddenly feeling peaceful. He saw that the gas lamps on both sides of the corridor were now dyed a faint blue. Amid the darkness, Dunn followed the stairs into the corridor. In his palm was a square, palm-sized box of ashes. This box looked as though it was made out of pure silver, but it also felt like it was human bones. It was carved with many mysterious patterns. Klein felt colder the closer he was to the box. It was as if the cold was rapidly seeping into his blood. Dunn's face was bathed in an icy blue light. He told Klein, go to Channy's Gate and pick out a sealed artifact with the highest offensive ability. Decide exactly which one with your own judgment. I've already told Sika and the keepers inside. Take note of the hidden threats. Of those, there are 3 Grade 2 sealed artifacts, which are... Oh, now that I've taken out the ashes of St. Selena, Sika and the keepers cannot leave their positions now. At this point, Fry and Royale were both at Kenley's house for the funeral preparations. The Archbishop at St. Selena Cathedral had gone to the countryside to preach. All right. Klein didn't hesitate, immediately turning towards the basement. When he was nearing the intersection, Klein suddenly stopped. He knew that most of the sealed artifacts behind Channy's Gate at Tingen City were Grade 3 and wouldn't have much of an effect on the baby in Migos' stomach. It was, at the very least, a legendary creature. The mutated Sun Sacred emblem might work, but it takes too long to have an effect. It's unsuitable for this. There are only 3 Grade 2 sealed artifacts in Tingen City, and they're all very dangerous artifacts that can easily result in my death. I estimate their powers to be about the same as my Flaring Sun charm, so I cannot have too many reservations later. I'll use the Flaring Sun charm without any hesitation. It would definitely be as powerful as a Grade 2 sealed artifact. After all, it has the power of divine blood in it. Klein's mind whirled as he nodded indiscernibly. He felt for the Flaring Sun charm and Azek's copper whistle in his pocket, but he was surprised to find that the sensation of the latter was back. Regardless of whether it was useful or not, Klein took out a pen and paper set that was used for divination and wrote a short message. The person who made my fate disharmonious and stole the skull of your child has appeared. He has arranged for Megos to enter the Blackthorn Security Company at 36 Zoutland Street. It's highly likely that Megos is harboring the son of an evil god. The situation is very urgent. He put away his pen and folded the piece of paper. Klein took out the copper whistle at the intersection and blew, then watched the giant skeleton messenger appear before him. In the corridor within the deep and serene basement, the nearly 4-meter-tall bone messenger disappeared before Klein's eyes after taking the letter. When all that was left of the surroundings were the classic gas lamps embedded in the walls, he put away Azek's copper whistle and walked towards Channy's gate. As he was writing the letter, he had already decided on which sealed artifact to pick. Firstly, it would be almost impossible for the Grade 3 sealed artifacts to have any effect on the baby in Migos' stomach. Unless it was an item like the mutated Sun Sacred Emblem which had hidden powers. But, at that very moment, in such a situation, Klein wasn't in the mood to explore or research a secret that might or might not exist. Plus, most sealed artifacts would carry a certain level of danger for the user. So, Klein eliminated the Grade 3 sealed artifacts that would weaken the user without affecting the enemy. Secondly, the Tingen Nighthawks didn't have any Grade 1 sealed artifacts and only 3 Grade 2 artifacts. That was originally a secret that Klein wasn't allowed to know, but due to the urgency of the situation, Dunn made use of an emergency clause and told him the general situation. Dunn Smith couldn't hold any other sealed artifacts at the same time while holding St. Selena's ashes. And behind the Tingen City's Channy's Gate, there were 3 Grade 2 sealed artifacts, 2030, 2078, and 2-105. The name of 2030 was Inexhaustible Poison. It originated from a Beyonder with an unknown sequence name who suddenly went mad and cut his wrist to commit suicide. He let his blood flow into an ordinary silver cup. But when his blood ran dry, the silver cup wasn't filled, and the liquid in the cup became crystal clear and alluring. It was a temptation that even a Sequence 5 Beyonder had failed to resist. After he drank the liquid, he died of poisoning on the spot. After the person died, the poison seeped out through his pores and pooled together again. Its volume was the same as before he drank it. Not one bit less. Dunn said that the researchers in the Holy Cathedral suspected that the poison could kill a high-sequence Beyonder. However, the question lay within the fact that it was almost impossible for a high-sequence Beyonder to be tempted to drink it. Furthermore, the traits of 2030 were obvious, so no one would consume it by accident. If one wanted to poison them, they had to first capture them, seize control of them, and then force it down their throat. But then, why go through the trouble? 2030 would constantly tempt the living things around it to drink it. The user had to be fully focused on resisting its power. Any slight negligence would make one drink the poison as though it was only natural to do so. When Dunn finished his description, Klein decided, almost instantly, to not pick that sealed artifact. The name of 2078 was Door of Death. Its appearance was like a normal wooden door. Any living thing that passed through it would die instantly. No high-sequence Beyonder had ever participated in the test. It possessed living traits and constantly attempted to escape. It could change its appearance and disguise itself into pre-existing doors. If the user made any mistakes, he would lose control of it. Then, he would need to be careful and not pass through any door near him. He would have to try to wait at the original spot for help or break through a wall to escape. Klein thought of using 2078, but after re-evaluating the latter two, he felt that the intuition of a legendary creature would be very sharp and would be able to differentiate whichever door was the door of death. In the end, he decided to pick 2-105. The name of the sealed artifact was Blood Vessel Thief. It looked like a thick, stiffened blood vessel. Anyone who touched it, regardless of whether they were protected or not, would have their life stolen. In the beginning, it wouldn't be obvious. But, if one didn't break contact with it, the effects would be visible half an hour later. Dunn said that a Sequence 5 heretic held onto it for 2 hours. He turned from a brawny man in his 30s into a hunched old man who had loose skin, thin white hair, and missing teeth. The most important trait of 2 to 105 was that the person wearing it would have the chance to steal an ability from a target within a specific range. Even high-sequence Beyonders could be robbed of their abilities, but the probability was smaller. Within a 10-minute time period, the person who was robbed would lose the corresponding ability while the person who wore the item would be able to use the ability skillfully. 10 minutes later, the ability would vanish, and the person who was robbed would need to wait a couple of days to recover. Regardless of whether it works or not, it will at least raise the probability of success from 5% to 10%. I'm the king of yellow and black who wields good luck, after all. Besides, our main goal is just to take precautions and make preparations to deal with the worst-case scenario. We won't necessarily have to take action. Hopefully, reinforcements will arrive soon. Klein stopped outside the duty room, showing no signs of hesitation anymore. About the negative effects of sealed artifact 2 to 105, he wasn't worried because he wasn't planning to use the artifact himself. His plan was to give it to Leonard, as he already had the Flaring Sun Charm and Azek's Copper Whistle, who he had no idea if it would still be suppressed. My dear poet, it's time for you to show your true secret. Klein muttered and saw Sika Tron standing by the duty room. With her white hair and black eyes, the part-time author remained silent for a few seconds before saying, "Why don't you guard Channy's gate? I'm stronger and more experienced than you. But you don't have Flaring Sun Charms." Klein replied with a smile, "Madam, I'm already a Sequence 8. It wouldn't be safe here either. There are many sealed artifacts that possess living traits that are itching to take action. Well, if we fail, the people here will definitely not survive. Heh, our goal upstairs is to buy time and wait for reinforcements. It might be safer than being around Channy's gate." Sika Tron puckered her lips slowly and drew a crimson moon on her chest. "May the goddess bless all of you." As Dunn didn't have the time to write the document in time, Klein couldn't enter Channy's gate directly. All he did was watch Sika Tron push open a tiny crack and enter. After a few minutes, she appeared by the door, and she was holding a thick, blood-tainted, pale blood vessel in her left hand. Klein extended his hand to take it, and he immediately felt a faint current surging in his body. In the reception hall of the Blackthorn Security Company, Leonard had already shaken off his stiff state from earlier, and his expression didn't look abnormal as he talked about the recently discovered house that Lenivus rented before. "Is that so? He never told me about it before." Megos replied normally, creasing her eyebrows slightly. Then, she grabbed her blonde hair, pulled out a handful, and casually threw it into the trash can by the side. Leonard was dumbfounded. He gulped with difficulty, and his palms were full of cold sweat once again. Klein walked up the stairs to the second floor with the blood vessel thief in his left hand. He looked at the door that led to the Nighthawk's break room, where Dunn Smith stood silently in his black windbreaker. His eyes were gray and deep, just like when they had first met. "Reintroducing myself, Nighthawk, Dunn Smith." The voice of the past sounded in Klein's ears as the scene of Dunn by Kenley's corpse flashed in his head. There was blood all over his mouth. He suddenly fell silent and walked over. He lifted his left hand and said, "Captain, I picked sealed artifact 2 to 105. I plan on letting Leonard use it." Dunn nodded slightly. He didn't ask why but turned and pointed at his office as he spoke. "The Holy Cathedral sent a telegram. They said that they'll gather a team of strong Beyonders immediately and asked us to stall for as much time as possible and try to wait. About those coincidences, they didn't give any reply. I think they don't have any conclusions as of yet. Or perhaps, the person who handles the telegrams doesn't know the actual situation and has no way to make guesses. You know, we have to make the best use of time. Telegrams can't be too long." "Yes." Klein nodded. He got closer to the partition and looked outside as he said, "How's the situation?" "Nothing strange as of yet." Dunn looked down at the Saint's ashbox in his left hand. Seeing how Leonard and Megos were having a good time chatting, Klein didn't interrupt them. He retreated to the Nighthawk's recreation room and faced Dunn with the corridor in between them. Just then, Dunn suddenly let out a self-deprecating laugh. "I forgot something." "What is it?" Klein replied, puzzled. Dunn looked sideways at him and said, "Daly told me to explain myself to you." "Huh?" Klein was stunned, as he couldn't quite understand what the captain meant. After 2 seconds, before Dunn could reply, he suddenly understood. Madame Daly didn't reply immediately because she thought it was unnecessary. She had forwarded the matter to the captain and let him explain himself. That means that there isn't anything serious with the captain. At this critical point, Klein suddenly felt a surge of joy erupt inside of him. Report chapter. Dunn sighed. I did want to send you away back then since I was going to do something that involves the secrets of the Church and the Nighthawks. But Kenley's death left my mind in chaos. At that moment, all I could think of was a clumsy excuse, thus, giving you the opportunity to witness what I was doing. What secret is that? Klein pressed, now being more at ease. He had almost forgotten about the threat of the evil god's son, or the existence of a legendary creature outside. Dunn weighed his words and said, there might be a law in mysticism. Hey, even though I haven't read many books, I'm still aware of what a law means. This law is called, Law of Beyonder Characteristics Indestructibility. The characteristics of a Beyonder is never destroyed or reduced. It's only passed from one carrier to the next. Klein's eyes opened wide. He suddenly came to a realization and asked thoughtfully, for example, the sealed artifacts, mysterious objects, or a potion's main ingredients that are left behind by Beyonders who have lost control. Correct. Dunn nodded solemnly. This isn't only the case for Beyonders who lose control, it's also the same for normal Beyonders after they die. The same. Klein mulled over Dunn's description, now having a faint idea of what the captain was doing. He suddenly recalled when the suited clown died. He recalled the blue, thumb-sized blood sphere that was suspended beside the corpse of the suited clown. Fry's explanation had been that there would always be strange transformations after a Beyonder died. Dunn continued with his deep gray eyes, but what's different about Beyonders who lose control is that a Beyonder who dies normally won't leave behind ingredients or objects. They're equivalent to a potion that corresponds to their sequences, except that they're lacking a certain amount of supplementary ingredients. Equivalent to potions. Equivalent to potions. Klein squinted as a flash of inspiration went through his mind. The endless darkness in his mind was illuminated in that instant. He suddenly understood many things, figuring out why the Beyonder pathways wouldn't be broken, even if the creatures used as main ingredients were going extinct. Apart from using substitutes, one could also simply use the remains of Beyonders. That should also be the reason why they only handed out complete potions at the higher sequences. Another reason is to prevent the formula from being revealed to people adept at divination or mediumship rituals. Many guesses went through Klein's mind. Dunn looked at the recreation room and explained in a deep voice, a few years ago. Well, I can't exactly remember just exactly how many years it was, but I wasn't the captain of the Nighthawks back then. I unexpectedly realized this problem, and after interacting with Daly, who had just become a Beyonder, I immediately sent a report to the Holy Cathedral. The Holy Cathedral told me to keep it a secret and gave me two choices. That's also the reason why it's me, and not Daly, who's explaining this to you. Whoever exposes this is responsible for it. The first choice was to pretend to know nothing, just like a large number of Nighthawk captains and deacons, and allow the Holy Cathedral to continue dealing with the remains of Beyonders who died through normal means. The second was for them to give me a unique, simple ritual and the corresponding techniques. It would allow me to temporarily consume the items produced by the unique characteristics within a limited period of time. Well, this is only suitable for sequences of the same pathway at my level or lower. This would augment my Beyonder characteristics, and I would also become more powerful. In terms of abilities regarding dreams, my powers now are not too different from a sequence 6A. That's also the reason why I dared to deal with Madame Sharon. So that's why. To think that something like this exists. Klein slowly exhaled. He finally understood why he couldn't come up with a logical explanation despite his best efforts. That was because he didn't have all the relevant information and was unable to fill in the blanks. Yes, this does match the law of Beyonder characteristics indestructibility. Would consuming these characteristics cause a qualitative change in the captain by constantly accumulating them? Klein allowed his mind to wander. After glancing at him, Dunn let out a bitter smile. I chose the second option, but not because I wanted to become more powerful. If I wanted to become more powerful, quickly digesting a potion and receiving an advancement is the best and most direct way. Yes, Klein agreed sincerely. Consolidating the characteristics of the potions of the same sequence will increase the risk of losing control at the same time as it improves your abilities, right? Dunn shook his head solemnly. No, these are the remains of normal Beyonders and not Beyonders who have lost control. Well, after I came to know of the acting method, I realized that it would increase the difficulty of digesting the potion. Then why do you still continue? Klein asked in shock. Dunn placed his hand into his pocket, intending to take out his pipe, only to find that he had left it in his office. He shook his head and let out a self-deprecating smile. I just said that becoming more powerful isn't the reason why I consume their remains. Having said that, he paused, his eyes wandering to the blue flicker of the gas lamp opposite where he was standing. They were all my partners. We've gone through many things together. We've dealt with monsters in the darkness and insane heretics together. Some of them have saved me, and I've saved quite a number of them. We walked together in the silent night. We fought together in battles that aren't visible to the general public. We faced danger together. We had each other's backs. I really can't bear to part with them. I remember the lad, Hitti. He broke into tears the first time we went on a dangerous mission. I remember Adelaide. Hey, he was Roseanne's father. He once blocked an evil curse for me with his arm. I remember the lady, Dwayne, and her warm temperament which was like the dawn. She would always silently record the things we encountered. I remember Kenley being someone who knew how to do many things like play the 7-string guitar, sing, tell stories, even though he wasn't tall. He was more like a poet than Leonard. I miss them very much. I hope to continue fighting with them, to continue dealing with the monsters in the darkness, to deal with the crazy heretics, to protect Tingen City with them. Thus, I chose to consume their remains. Dunn's gray eyes seemed to flicker. His reliable and dependable persona broke down considerably at that moment. His lips arched upward slightly as he continued, "They're still with me in my dreams. Adelaide loves to read, and he often reads at the solarium. He often tells me to discipline Roseanne and get her to mature faster, to the point that Roseanne complains about me becoming more and more like her father and has become scared of me. Hitti is a person who cannot sit still and has to hunt in the forest every day. Dwayne always stands by the window of her bedroom and watches us chat. Kenley, who recently joined, created his own 7-string guitar and sings while strumming it. I really miss them." Captain Klein subconsciously muttered. His eyes became blurred and watery. He couldn't help but rub his eyes and curse in his heart. Fuck. Captain, you're making me cry. But I finally understand the reason for the captain's slow progress despite using the acting method. Klein let out a silent sigh. Unfortunately, old Neil died after losing control. Otherwise, he would have brought along much joy to us. Dunn retracted his gaze. He lowered his head and massaged the bridge of his nose. A few seconds later, he lifted his head and let out a bitter smile. This is a selfish decision. I don't know what the true wishes of Adelaide, Kenley, and the rest were, and, thus, selfishly made a decision for them. I truly am a selfish person. No, Klein shook his head. On the sofa in the receptionist area, Leonard watched Megos pull out clumps of her hair as his expression became more and more rigid. Megos seemed increasingly restless as she constantly picked up the glass for a mouthful of water. She looked at Leonard with a contorted expression. I don't know why, but I suddenly feel a little unwell. Leonard Mitchell was about to reply when he suddenly saw Megos reach for her face. She clawed out a piece of flesh, a long piece of flesh stained with blood. My face is a little itchy. Megos smiled, a little embarrassed. The edge of her lips spread to where her cheekbones were, revealing a row of white teeth and bright red gums. Fuck. Leonard cursed out silently. He felt that the situation was worsening way too quickly. His lips quivering, Leonard turned to listen as his expression immediately turned steely green. He forced a smile and apologized to Megos, who was clawing out pieces of her flesh. I need to use the bathroom. Al, right? Megos's tone became ethereal. She rubbed her belly and said, my child is a little restless. Leonard didn't reply. He hastened his footsteps and approached the partition. After entering the corridor, Leonard stared deeply at the box of ash in Dunn Smith's hands and exhaled in exasperation. Following that, his expression turned firm. Captain, I'm afraid that it's too late. We have to deal with Megos and her baby immediately. Otherwise, the whole of Tingen will suffer terrible losses. This isn't something that can be avoided just by evacuating the citizens around us. I know that you've already sent such a telegram. Dunn knitted his eyebrows and asked, unusually stern, are you sure that the situation has worsened to such an extent? Yes. In no more than 3 minutes, Megos will undergo a mutation, and her child will descend upon us, Leonard said with a certain tone. At the same time, he glanced at the thick, large blood vessel wrapped around Klein's hand and said, sealed artifact 2-105? Let me use it. I can better utilize its abilities. All right. Klein didn't hesitate to hand the blood vessel thief over to Leonard. That was something he intended to do so from the beginning. At that moment, Dunn tugged at his collar and patted down his windbreaker. He spoke with a determined tone, I'll head out with St. Selena's ashes first. Come out after 10 seconds. Remember, come out only after you finish counting to 10. Then, regardless of my condition, direct your strongest attacks at Megos and her baby without wasting any time." With that said, he turned around and walked towards the partition with the urn of ashes. "Captain!" Klein let out a shout, his lips dry. "Captain!" Leonard also shouted. Dunn stopped and looked back. He had a gentle expression as he said with his mellow voice, "Don't worry about me. I'm not alone. Adelaide, Dwayne, Hitty, and Kenley are all fighting alongside me, no matter what kind of danger I face." He paused for a moment before speaking, his gray eyes gentle. "There's no need to be too nervous as well. We're guarding Tingen City." His lips arched upwards, forming his usual smile. After saying those words, he didn't stay any longer. He stepped through the partition, his black windbreaker following behind him. "Captain!" Klein and Leonard shouted at the same time, their tears falling uncontrollably, but Dunn didn't slow down. "We are guardians, but also a bunch of miserable wretches that are constantly fighting against threats and madness." Report chapter. Beep, beep, beep. The telegram set up in the captain's office suddenly came to life, seemingly having received a new telegram. But Klein and Leonard couldn't be distracted. They were counting the movements of the second hand on the clock as their red eyes welled up with tears. 10, 9, 8, ellipsis. Just then, Dunn Smith carried the silver, bone-like square box into the reception hall with a solemn expression. Megos, who was pulling out clump after clump of blonde hair, tore a wound that was deep enough to show her bones. It was as though she was triggered by something. She suddenly stood and pointed at Dunn Smith in his black windbreaker. She shrieked, "You want to kill my child! You want to kill my child!" Boom! The shrill and terrifying voice reverberated. Klein felt like he was being struck in the head with a sledgehammer. He suddenly forgot to count as he had a headache and felt dizzy. His vision went red, and there seemed to be liquid flowing from the tip of his nose. He subconsciously looked sideways, and he saw the corner of Leonard Mitchell's eyes. The tip of his nose and the corners of his lips were covered in fresh blood. His face was extremely pale, and his body was wavering as though he was about to fall. "I'm probably in the same state." Klein reined back his thoughts and continued to count in silence as he skipped 2 numbers. 5, 4, ellipsis. Struck by the terrifyingly sharp voice, Dunn Smith's deep gray eyes were filled with red veins. Every single strand was crystal clear. The blood vessels in his face protruded out as well, every one of them like a poisonous snake. There was also a gurgle as red liquid flowed out of his ears as well. Despite that, he did feel dizzy. Other than his right hand pausing, his strong willpower drove him to press down on St. Selena's urn and open the lid. Inside the box, there was deep darkness. In the darkness, there was fine resplendent sand. The scene was magically beautiful, just like a starry night being stored in a box. The surroundings suddenly became dark, and the darkness engulfed the entire reception hall. In the air, there were countless black, cold, and smooth threads were floating. They surged towards Megos and entangled her almost instantly. It wasn't like a spider web, but more like the tentacles of some unknown creature. Megos had already torn out her right eyeball. It hung by a thin cord of flesh underneath her eye socket. She stared at Dunn Smith with hatred as she roared, "You must die!" Bang! Dunn was cast away by a formless force and slammed heavily into the wall opposite. The wall cracked, and bricks were thrown up. He spat a mouthful of fresh blood onto the ground, but both his hands were still tightly holding onto St. Selena's urn. He held onto it for dear life and kept it from falling to the ground. Those countless black, cold, and smooth threads tightened and bound Megos firmly to the spot. No matter how much blight-tainted flames rose up suddenly, or how her skin began to secrete a liquid that smelt like brimstone, neither of those defenses dealt any damage to the threads holding onto her. 3, 2, 1. Klein and Leonard dashed out through the partition simultaneously. One of them was holding onto a warm thin gold slice, and the other had already aimed his 5 fingers with the blood vessel thief wound around his left wrist at Megos. Megos, who no longer looked human, struggled as flesh protruded from both sides of her shoulders. They were a mixture of blood vessels and green veins, round like a child's head. Above the 2 heads, cracks rapidly spread and seemingly turned into a pair of eyes. Megos suddenly noticed danger approaching, and she opened her mouth. The corner of her lips cracked all the way up to her ears. She was going to deal the blaspheme curse to every enemy that attempted to harm her child. At that moment, Leonard clenched his left hand into a fist as his wrist made a half-turn. His pale face turned livid, and the vessels protruded like bunch of tiny poisonous worms. Migos's blaspheme curse was left stuck in her throat as it came to a sudden halt. She seemed to have lost the ability to speak and the ability to evoke curses. Klein seized the opportunity and muttered an ancient Hermes word in a deep voice. Light. I want light, and there will be light. He suddenly felt the thin gold slice that was covered in mysterious patterns become boiling hot as he saw it emit a blinding light, as though it had become a miniature sun. Right on the heels of that, Klein injected more than half his spirituality into it and threw the flaring sun charm towards the restrained Megos. The reception hall instantly turned transparent as darkness and gloominess vanished simultaneously. The black fine threads that entangled Megos shrank as though they were instinctively avoiding something. But before Megos obtained her freedom, she already saw the sunlight. At some point in the fight, a hole had ruptured in the ceiling of the Blackthorn Security Company, and the hole went all the way to the rooftop of the third floor. The bright blue sky and glaring sunlight shined through simultaneously. The thin gold slice combined with the sunlight above Migos's and immediately expanded in size. It went from a spherical light to a sphere with countless flames spiraling around it. Rumble. The entire building shook vigorously, and the glass windows on the nearby streets shattered. However, the power of the spherical light concentrated its might at its core, without dissipating much. It enveloped Megos, and the light was so glaring that Klein, Dunn, and Leonard couldn't open their eyes. Klein held back his tears and looked through squinted eyes. He saw that the light had dispersed, but the flames were still soaring. Among them, there were many black ashes dancing in the air. Megos and the baby in her stomach were nowhere to be seen. Just like the coffee table, water glass, newspaper, and sofa in the area. Is it over? Did we finish the son of an evil god before it descended upon this world, taking his mother out at the same time? Klein still couldn't believe it. His experience of playing video games told him that the final boss couldn't be taken care of so easily. Suddenly, he felt goosebumps all over. His clown instincts told him that there was extreme danger approaching. Without thinking, Klein rolled to the left abruptly. Just then, a long arm with an extremely sharp white bone blade cleaved the spot, seemingly out of nowhere. The monstrosity had an abnormal beauty, and it floated in midair. It was unbelievably fast and almost impossible to dodge its attacks. Whoosh! Klein's clothing on the right side of his chest was ripped apart, his skin ruptured, and his flesh, along with his bones, was split into two. The wound was so deep that he could almost see one of his lungs. If it wasn't because he sensed danger approaching beforehand and dodged in time, that slash would have sliced him in half. But, even so, Klein slowed down. Extreme pain filled his head and scattered his consciousness. At the end of the white bone blade, a figure rapidly flew out. If it wasn't for the bump on its stomach, perhaps no one could identify it as Megos. Her hair and dress had been burned entirely. The skin on her face and body was charred black and was peeling off, flake after flake. Her nose had melted, leaving only two small black holes behind. Her eyeballs were nowhere to be seen, and there were faint white flames dancing in the empty sockets. The two heads that had popped up from both sides of Migos's shoulders had been burned away. Her left arm had become the white bone blade that she was holding. It looked demonic, yet holy. Creak. As the ground shook, Megos ignored Dunn and Leonard, as well as the black, cold, and smooth fine threads that were hurtling towards her again. She phased over to Klein, who had come to a stop after rolling away. She aimed the white bone blade at Klein's neck and was about to slash down. Suddenly, she heard a voice that contained a rich blasphemous tone. Submit. Leonard lifted his left hand and aimed his palm at Megos. The sealed artifact 2-105 wrapped around his wrist had turned from a thick pale, blood-tainted blood vessel into a crimson intestine that had expanded to the point that it looked ready to explode. With the aid of the blood vessel thief, Leonard had successfully stolen Migos's blaspheme curse and was attempting to use her power to seize control of her. Only an ability at her level was effective. Under the influence of the blaspheme curse, Megos bent her waist, and her knees were constantly trembling. Her motions came to a halt as the surrounding black threads surrounded her as though they had found a delicious prey. Klein also took the opportunity to roll in the opposite direction, leaving a trail of fresh crimson blood behind him. However, he got some reprieve from his extreme pain and reached his hand into his pocket. He took out the last flaring sun charm. He took the opportunity when Megos was stationary to finish her off, once and for all. If she were to hold out until the baby was born, the outcome would be beyond their imagination. Boom! Migos's head exploded on its own. Her charred skin and flesh flew in all directions. But her headless body seized the opportunity to shake off the effect of the blaspheme curse. Boom! Migos' charred body transformed into a projectile that shot towards Leonard. Since the blaspheme curse had been forcefully disrupted, Leonard was temporarily frozen on the spot. At that moment, Dunn Smith was still holding onto St. Selena's urn tightly. His face was abnormally pale, and the black, cold threads that were created was still short of surrounding Megos. Creak! Megos slammed into Leonard, throwing him to the wall. The wall collapsed from the impact. Leonard's bones cracked, and there was blood spewing out from his mouth incessantly. Without even having the urge to struggle, he fainted instantly. Megos raised her white bone blade, but the countless black threads that emanated from St. Selena's urn enveloped her again and was about to bind her to the ground. Without the luxury of time to mind his injuries, Klein quickly took out the thin charm. Just as he was going to recite the ancient Hermes incantation, something suddenly sounded in the deep, dark, yet quiet room. Wah! It was the cry of a baby. Wah! The baby in Migos' stomach cried. It squirmed, wanting to come into this world in a bid to help its mother escape from her predicament. The black, cold, and smooth threads appeared to suffer a shock as they seemed to be suppressed by an invisible power which led to their retreat backward. Wah! Dunn and Klein became dizzy at the same time. They felt their throats contract involuntarily as their contracting air passages instantly stifled them. Crimson liquid flowed from their nostrils, their eyes, and their ears. All of their capillaries seemed to have ruptured. If it wasn't for the fact that Klein had undergone the torture of hearing the mutterings and ravings every time he headed to the world above the grey fog, as well as Dunn holding onto the ashes of St. Selena, they definitely would have fainted on the spot, just like Leonard Mitchell. Migos' headless body turned over and looked at Klein, who saw her charred skin and flesh peeling to the ground, and the holy, yet evil white bone blade. Having escaped its influence thanks to his rich experience, Klein immediately felt his scalp tingle and forgot about the pain in his right chest. He seemed to witness his enemy charge towards him maniacally, not giving him any time to recite the incantation, infuse spirituality, and throw out the flaring sun charm. Just as he was about to dodge the attack, Klein saw Megos suddenly pause. He saw Dunn Smith's black windbreaker fluttering, and the captain diagonally across him had buried his head. There were multiple thick twitching objects on his back as if they were venomous snakes or tentacles, or monsters. Dunn was using his abilities as a nightmare to forcefully impede Migos' movements. Bam! 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 With a mere struggle from Megos, the thick tentacle-like objects that protruded from Dunn's back exploded at the same time. A large amount of blood splattered out, covering every corner of the room like rain. Dunn wasn't disappointed at the result, for the blood had been absorbed by the black threads created by St. Selena's ashes. They had been absorbed. The countless cold, smooth, tentacle-like threads entered a frenzy. They swarmed forward and bound Megos tightly, wrapping themselves around her bulging, squirming stomach. An opportunity. Klein was as nervous as he was excited. He prepared to shout the ancient Hermes word for light. Wah! 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 The cries of a baby could be heard once again, more frequent, and more incessant this time around. The countless black threads suddenly came to a pause, retreating and trembling again as if they had all been struck by lightning. Dunn's expression changed when he realized that Megos was about to free herself. Without hesitation, he retracted his right palm, formed a claw, and stabbed it into his own chest, his left chest. He quickly pulled out his right hand, his fingers holding a bloody heart tightly. It was a still-beating heart that brought with it the sereneness of the night and a dream. Captain? Klein watched helplessly as Dunn Smith stuffed the heart into the urn containing St. Selena's ashes. His vision quickly blurred. Whoosh! 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 Crying that sounded like a late-night nightmare resounded. The countless cold and serene threads once again resumed their efforts as they wrapped themselves tightly around Megos. This time, they didn't loosen their bindings despite the cries coming from the baby in Migos' stomach. In fact, they even sealed the terrifying sounds within the body. Klein's tears fell together with his blood. He uttered a simple Hermes term in a deep voice, light. The light that illuminates the darkness. The light that brings warmth. He infused almost all of his remaining spirituality into the thin gold piece etched with mysterious symbols, causing his mind to immediately turn blank and dizzy. Having mustered the last of his strength, Klein tossed out the flaring sun charm at Megos, who was still bound by the countless black threads. The black threads didn't retract this time, having not followed their instincts, as if they were being willed by someone. Thump! Thump! Dunn's fresh heart was still beating within the box containing St. Selena's ashes. The sunlight once again shone in from the hole in the ceiling, shining through all 3 stories, right into the Blackthorn Security Company, as if it were a corporeal pillar. It was guided here by the flaring sun charm, and it was focused on Megos. The sunlight fused with the top of the headless monster, and then exploded like the sun. Rumble. In the burning white splendor, Klein closed his eyes. This last scene was etched deep into his mind. Megos's body lost its left arm, head, and multiple pieces of flesh. Its charred body crumbled instantly. The half-illusory, terrifying creature within her body no longer had the support of a physical body and couldn't complete the last stage of its transformation. It turned into a furious ball of black gas, dissolving amidst the light and flames. Rumble. The entire building shook violently, but this was only due to the released energy of the flaring sun charm. The charm was different from a normal bomb. Its powers were concentrated, yet restrained. Klein fought to stabilize his body. He opened his eyes and looked ahead a few seconds later. He saw that the walls had crumbled. He saw a charred circle where Megos once stood. Surprisingly, the floor had only melted slightly. He saw a burned, bloody placenta on the ground. He saw Dunn Smith standing on the spot, still wearing his black windbreaker. He saw the heart in the box of St. Selena's ashes still beating slowly. He saw Leonard Mitchell lying on the opposite side. His outcome was unknown. The exhausted Klein felt elated and felt that he could still use ritualistic magic to save the captain. He felt that Megos and her baby were truly finished. No, it was more accurate to say that the latter had suffered an interruption and was exorcised. At that moment, Dunn Smith turned to look at Klein. His pale face had a warm and relaxed expression, and his voice still as mellow as it usually was. "We saved Tingen." After saying this, it was as if he had returned to the time when he was 20. He no longer appeared stern and serious as he winked at Klein with his left eye. Klein's expression froze. He saw the heart in the box of St. Selena's ashes stop beating. It turned into a resplendent ball of light before scattering into the surroundings. He saw the captain fall backward, his arms losing their strength. It felt like the scene was made up of a series of paintings, but Klein could do nothing to stop it. Thump! The box of St. Selena's ashes fell onto the ground, just like Klein's heart. Thud! Thud! Even though the box wasn't covered, the darkness within the box sealed the opening, preventing the resplendent sand like ashes from falling out. The box rolled a distance away towards Klein. Dunn Smith fell to the wrecked floor, his deep gray eyes having lost all their luster. He was looking at the hole in the ceiling, the sunlight pouring down on his face. Captain! Klein's vision blurred once again. He wanted to shout, but that word and the subsequent words were stuck in his throat. "We miss you too." At that moment, the box containing St. Selena's ashes had rolled to his feet. Suddenly, Klein felt a pain in his chest, his pupils violently constricted as he froze in place. He looked down to see a slightly pale palm, drenched in blood, coming out the left side of his chest. Megos isn't dead. No, a new enemy. The mastermind behind the scenes. Am I going to die? Klein quickly lost his consciousness, his eyes almost losing focus. His body slumped to the side. His breathing gradually slowed and, he finally felt the palm pull back quickly. He saw a pair of brand-new leather boots, and a hand reaching downward, a slightly pale hand. It grabbed the urn of St. Selena's ashes. Klein's vision went black, and he lost all consciousness. Burned and shattered objects were scattered around in the now destroyed Blackthorn Security Company, but there wasn't a single sound, it was just like a cemetery. A few minutes later, Leonard Mitchell's body moved, his eyes opening slowly. He propped himself up with difficulty and surveyed the surroundings. He saw Dunn Smith on the ground. He also saw Klein, who had his eyes staring wide as a look of shock was plastered across his face. Dunn and Klein both had visible wounds on the left sides of their chests. "No," Leonard squeezed out the word from his throat as he staggered towards Klein's corpse, that wasn't far away from Dunn. He kept checking them, going between the two repeatedly, but all he could do was accept this irreversible truth. Leonard's knees buckled as his knees plopped to the ground. His green eyes were filled with pain as tears streamed down his cheeks, washing away the blood and dust. He turned his head and listened for 2 seconds and suddenly sprawled forward. He let out an angry roar and clenched his palms into fists, and heavily pounded the floor. Thump! 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 Leonard kept tearing up as he pounded the floor. Amidst his sorrow was a feeling of clear hatred and a clear sense of self-abhorrence. Thud! Thud! Thud. Leonard looked up when he heard the sounds of hurried footsteps and saw the members of the mandated punishers and the machinery hivemind that had just arrived at the scene through his blurred vision. In a Tingen suburb, there was a house with a green lawn. The house had a garden that had begun to wither at the beginning of September. Attached to the house was a crimson chimney. There was a desk next to the window in the bedroom of that house. An ordinary notebook was spread open on the table. A slightly pale hand flipped the notebook to the very first page, then it quickly flipped to the back. As the paper flipped, the rows of words appeared faintly. Regents, a member from the secret order, sold the Antigonus family's notebook as an ordinary ancient book by accident due to the influence both of weariness and illusions. It was a coincidence that made logical sense. Affected by the calling of the Antigonus family's bloodline, the notebook secretly affects its owners, one after the other. After repeated changes in ownership, it came to Tingen. It fell into the hands of the members of the Aurora Order, Sirius Arapus and Hannes Vincent. After they flipped through the content that temporarily appeared in the notebook and copied the corresponding potion formulas, Sirius and Hannes were worried that the secret order, who were good at divination, would track them down. After discussing it, they decided to avoid the risk by selling it to another person. They didn't wait for Mr. Z's reply, perhaps because he stayed at Enmat Harbor. Through Sirius's introduction, Hannes got to know Welch McGovern from the Coy University's Department of History. Then, Hannes sold the Antigonus family's notebook to McGovern as an ordinary ancient book. Subsequently, Sirius was attracted by the treasure that was said to exist on the main peak of the Hornassus mountain range. He started to visit the Deweyville Library and research the mountain. He didn't think that there would be any problems, so he left his real address and name. That aligned with his personality. During this process, he acquainted himself with Lenevis, who was reading up on information about iron mines to set up a scam. Lenevis's hidden lunacy and swindling ability were well appreciated by Sirius. He decided to nurture him into a member of the Aurora Order. Of course, before that, an investigation was inevitable. Sirius covertly informed Lenevis about the evil ritual of praying to the true creator to deliver his spawn into this world. But he knew that the possibility of Lenevis succeeding was very low, because the difficulty level of the ritual was very high, and the requirements were very harsh. However, the latter expressed his strong interest in the matter, tempted by the possibility of obtaining a deity's approval. He planned to complete the ritual simultaneously as he carried out the plans of establishing his steelworks company. The cunning Lenevis could tell that there was something fishy about Sirius Arapus. But for his personal goal, he didn't expose him. He visited Hood Eugen in the asylum once again. They had known each other long ago, and they knew about their respective situations. After a dark divination, the Antigonus family's notebook was awakened fully. Welch and his classmate died. The lucky survivor, Klein Moretti, sent it to Ray Bieber's house under the influence of the notebook. It was a destined ending. Many rows were scribbled off and new content followed. For some baffling reason, and a lack of sufficient explanations, Klein didn't commit suicide after that and somehow managed to stay alive. In the Nighthawks investigation of Welch's case that followed, he met Dunn Smith and joined the Nighthawks. Although it had already exceeded Ince Zangwill's description, it didn't affect the development of the story. Bacchus and his brothers were down on their luck. They lost their last chip at the gambling tables and were drowning in debt. In a bid to obtain money, they decided to kidnap and blackmail the somewhat wealthy individuals. When they were looking for their final hideout, they chanced upon the room opposite Ray Bieber's apartment. By then, Ray Bieber was already seduced by the power offered by the Antigonus family's notebook. He hoped to digest the gift left behind by his ancestors. However, he was in a semi-insane state, and he couldn't make the best and safest choice. He abandoned his dead mother, but he continued remaining in Tingen City. He only found a more elusive spot to carry out his digestion ritual. It was truly pathetic. If he had been slightly smarter, the story could have become even more complicated, but his decision was made based on his instincts and his poor state of mind. Bacchus and company purchased weapons and took the youngest son, Elliot, of the tobacco merchant, Vicroy, and held him for ransom. Finally, they successfully carried out the abduction and took Elliot back to the apartment opposite Ray Bieber's. Vicroy's butler was entrusted with looking for help from a security company. Because of Welch's mysterious death, security companies were short on hands. Clay chanced upon a deliveryman and happened to discover the existence of the Blackthorn Security Company. Leonard Mitchell and Klein accepted the job. Relying on their Beyonder powers, they quickly saved the merchant's son. Regrettably, Klein didn't immediately realize that clues to the Antigonus family's notebook were in the apartment opposite them. However, his spirituality reminded him in his dream. As such, the Tingen Nighthawks discovered corresponding clues. Sealed artifact 2049 arrived in Tingen. With the aid of the Antigonus family's puppet, Dunn Smith led the Nighthawks to find Ray Bieber before interrupting his digestion procedure. Ray Bieber became a monster, and the situation was out of control. In the end, the Nighthawks skillfully worked together and took care of Monster Bieber, but they immediately faced the attack of a member from the Secret Order. More rows were scribbled away again, and the original content was impossible to read. Leonard Mitchell, who possesses a secret, was going to end the situation. Before he could, Klein, who was supposed to be doomed, killed the Sequence 7 member from the Secret Order in an inexplicable manner. That didn't affect the development of the story. Dunn Smith got in touch with the Antigonus family's notebook and flipped through its content. From that point onwards, he was secretly tainted. Ellipsis. Having finished with all his preparations, Lenivus beguiled Hood Eugen and used him to assist in his ritual. They tricked Lenivus's fiancée, Megos, to become the vessel that would carry the true creator's spawn. Lenivus had almost no possibility of success. The most serious problem was that even though Megos would be protected by the ritual's power, she wouldn't be able to withstand the sexual intercourse with the illusory projection of a deity. It would cost her her life on the altar. At that moment, the kind Ince Zangwill helped Lenivus in secret. He split off half a piece of a descendant of Death's characteristic that he obtained and planted it into Megos's body ahead of time. Hood Eugen made Megos enter a semi-unconscious state and convinced her that the true creator's illusory projection was Lenivus. Nourished by the accumulated resentment, gloominess, and oppression of the factory district, the ritual succeeded. Megos was pregnant with the true creator's spawn. The deity saw through the coincidences, but since he wished to break through the shackles placed on him by the 7 deities, he didn't refuse. Hood Eugen was contaminated. After the ritual succeeded, the mad Lenivus regained his rationality. He clearly knew that if the deity's spawn was to descend into the world, Lenivus, himself, would become one of the sacrificial offerings. How could a mortal be the father of a deity's son? This was blasphemy of the highest order. Lenivus decided to leave Tingen ahead of time and left clues to the Nighthawks, the mandated Punishers, and the machinery Hivemind so that they could resolve the repercussions of his actions. There was ultimately a price needed for lunacy. However, Lenivus didn't write the letter directly to the Beyonder squads. He thought it would make him look stupid. He decided to leave the letter in one of the houses that he rented. He pretended to be playing a game with the Beyonders from official bodies. As such, he didn't bring up Hood Eugen's contamination and brought with him everything that he had obtained. Just in case, he informed Sirius Erebus in the safest way he could. The latter didn't quite believe him, but he could faintly feel the possibility of success. Selena Wood accidentally chanced upon the real magic mirror divination incantation from her mysticism teacher, Hannes Vincent. Her bold attempt was interrupted by Klein Moretti by coincidence. The latter successfully resolved this supernatural incident that might have caused serious casualties. The Nighthawks then investigated Hannes Vincent, who had recently been awarded. Therefore, Dunn Smith coincidentally saw a clear image of the true creator in his dream and suffered severe injuries. However, he wasn't contaminated because of what happened. That would have been noticed by the upper echelons of the Nighthawks. The injury made Dunn Smith's contamination by the Antigonus family notebook worsen. His absent-mindedness and forgetfulness worsened, and he was getting closer and closer to satisfying Ince Zangwill's requirements. Many rows were scribbled away again. Seriously unbelievable. Klein Moretti noticed Ince Zangwill's secret influence and saw the Crimson Chimney. This is because he was reminded by the teacher from the Khoi University's Department of History, Azek. He possesses many secrets. But even so, it's astounding enough for Klein to discover actual clues. It's unexplainable. Regardless of the reason, Ince Zangwill continued to act, and the story continues. Klein coincidentally ran into Sirius at the library and had no choice but to kill him. Hence, the clues leading to Lenivus were abruptly severed, and the discovery of the problem was delayed. Klein met Megos, but his spirituality stopped him from observing her closely. However, he didn't notice the subtle abnormality. That is logical. Our stories aren't made up randomly. He searched for the Red Chimney, but he always opted for a route that didn't include his target. Maybe in another 2 or 3 months, when he was on the last batch, he would find the real Red Chimney house. Rows and rows of writings were scribbled away, more than all of the previous rows added together. Dunsmith's problem was alleviated. His condition obviously became better. He actually mastered the acting method. And this was taught to him by Klein Moretti, who found inspiration from Daily Simone and Old Neil's example. No, Ince Zangwill didn't believe that, but he could only change his original plan slightly. New elements in the story came to play. Azek decided to go to Backland in search of his lost memories. It wasn't long until Klein and Dunn found clues from Hood Eugen. In order to ensure that Tingen City's Conservative Party and New Party would be in complete opposition, Madame Sharon, who wanted to vent the accumulated madness after her transformation, decided to take the risk and murder Member of Parliament John Maynard. Her motive wasn't strong enough, but she took action anyway. There are always times when people are not clear-minded enough, and she happened to be in that stage. Besides, she was confident that she wouldn't be discovered. Maynard's wife found the Blackthorn Security Company through the tobacco merchant, Viceroy. They didn't disappoint her, and they quickly found Madame Sharon's abnormality. Dunn Smith, who possessed power that was close to Sequence 6, decided to take action first. He passed the sealed artifact 30271 to Kenley. When the two of them and Klein returned to Madame Sharon's residence, Dunn attempted to pull her into a dream to control her from a distance. It was a good plan, but, unfortunately, Madame Sharon happened to have the statue of the primordial demoness by her side. Hence, the Nighthawk's plan failed. Kenley reflected himself in the mirror due to his nervousness and saw himself. Madame Sharon was taken care of while Kenley died. Dunn blamed himself and consumed Kenley's Beyander characteristic as he usually did. His digestion procedure was interrupted as a result and was delayed. As such, his mental state became unstable. Under the circumstances, Leonard and Klein noticed the letter left behind by Lenivus. Megos received a baffling summoning and arrived at Zoutland Street. She entered the Blackthorn Security Company, and the baby in her stomach was at a critical point in its development. It couldn't stop her urges. Dunn made a detailed plan, a plan that was right, but he made one mistake. If he steeled his resolve to Megos behind Channy's gate, he would have stood a chance with the aid of the environment and the items present. If he wanted to wait for backup, he definitely shouldn't have just taken St. Selena's urn out. Unfortunately, Dunn's mind wasn't in the right place due to recent events, and he didn't think of the most critical point. A deity's son would be able to feel the threat of the saint's urn. Hence, it was triggered and started to absorb its mother's strength in a bid to be born ahead of time, even though it wasn't exactly ready. Azek was in Backland, but he wasn't a traveler, so he couldn't rush back in such short notice. A few rows were scribbled away. Megos became a monster, and the fight began. With the aid of the Saint's Urn, Bloodvessel Thief, and two high-level charms that strangely appeared, Megos died and the deity's son was exorcised. Dunn Smith died as a result, and the power of St. Selena's ashes was severely damaged as well. That went perfectly with Ince Zangwill's intentions. Ince Zangwill didn't get a chance to showcase himself, but it didn't hinder him from achieving his goal. He killed Klein Moretti, the fellow who kept disrupting his plans, and he took away St. Selena's ashes. Ince Zangwill set up a ritual with the remaining half of the characteristic of Death's descendant. He consumed St. Selena's ashes and successfully advanced from Sequence 5 of the Death Sequence pathway, Gatekeeper, to Sequence 4 of the Evernight Sequence pathway, Nightwatcher. As such, he received godhood characteristics and became a demigod. The sun continues to shine brilliantly on the land. Nearly no one in Tingen City realized how they narrowly escaped a huge disaster. Monster Ademisal would be left very confused about it. The notebook was flipped to the last page. A middle-aged man that was holding onto the book had dark blonde hair, a dark blue eye that was nearly black, a tall nose, and tightly pursed lips. His facial features were like that of a statue and didn't have a single wrinkle. He held a classic quill with his slightly pale hand and wrote a line clearly without dipping into any ink. He ended with a simple sentence. Tingen's story ends here. The papers rustled as he closed the book, leaving only a brown cover. Report chapter. In the basement of St. Selena Cathedral, in the guardroom outside Channy's Gate. Leonard Mitchell was leaning on the back of his chair, his legs were propped up on the table. His eyes were vacant without any focus. Even though he had been healed using ritualistic magic, he still looked terrible, as if he had obtained reprieve from a severe illness without fully recovering. At the moment, the powerful Beyonders sent by the Holy Cathedral were creating another seal behind the Channy's Gate since the ashes of St. Selena was lost. They had conflicting opinions, some wanting to fill in the gap of power using a new holy item, while the others believed that there was no need to go through all the trouble. After all, to the Church of the Evernight Goddess, holy items were rare and incredibly precious. What they suggested was lowering the presence of the Nighthawks in Tingen and transferring the artifacts with living characteristics or difficult-to-seal artifacts to the headquarters at the Cathedral of Serenity in Baklan's diocese, only leaving behind those that could be controlled more easily. They intended to send a telegram to propose a meeting of the higher-ups, to get a vote from the archbishops and high-ranking deacons. Leonard was uninterested in this debate. He felt as if he had become a living corpse, with no sorrow, grief, agitation, or excitement. He was abnormally numb. He didn't want to face anyone. All he wanted was to stay alone in the corner. Occasionally, he would feel puzzled about why the murderer would only take away Klein's Beyander characteristic and leave Captain Dunn Smith's one intact. Thud, thud, thud. Footsteps reverberated in the corridor. Sika Tron, whose right arm had been bandaged, appeared at the door of the guardroom. While Klein and the others were attacking Megos and attempting to save Tingen City, she and the keepers within Channy's Gate were doing battle against a portion of the sealed artifacts. If it wasn't for the timely arrival of the members of the mandated Punishers and the Machinery Hivemind, or the eventual arrival of the reinforcements from the Holy Cathedral, she also might have lost her life. But even so, the elderly keeper failed to last until the end. He fought to his death, under the call of duty. Leonard, I found an unencrypted telegram in the captain's office. It was sent over by the Holy Cathedral, Sikatron said. Leonard's green eyes moved slightly, finally coming to life. He faintly recalled the sound of a new telegram coming in, but the battle was about to begin. He and Klein didn't have the time to pay attention to it. What does it say? Leonard noticed that his tone was unusually raspy. The white-haired and black-eyed Sika Tron replied without hesitation, beware of Ince Zangwil. Beware of sealed artifact 008. Ince Zangwil, the archbishop that betrayed the church, the gatekeeper who failed his advancement. Sealed artifact 008, an ordinary-looking quill. Leonard muttered at first as he searched his memories, then he tilted his head to the side. He suddenly narrowed his eyes, the dispirited feelings and sadness disappeared from his body. So that's how it was. Leonard pulled his feet back and stood up, his green eyes burning with a passion. He looked at Sika Tron and said, I intend to apply to join the Red Gloves. The Red Gloves was a codename for the elite team of Nighthawks. Under normal circumstances, Nighthawk teams were situated locally and had regions under their jurisdiction. They were not permitted to capture criminals outside of their area of jurisdiction without permission. As such, some evildoers would change their location after every crime, making it terribly inconvenient for the Nighthawks. To deal with this, the Church of the Evernight Goddess set up the Red Gloves. They were carefully selected elites, some even possessing incomplete holy items. Their mission was to reinforce Nighthawk teams that had called for help, as well as track down and arrest evildoers without any restrictions. In some circles, they were also called pursuers, or hunting dogs. Red Gloves? But their lowest requirement is Sequence 7. Besides, the dangers the Red Gloves face are many times higher than an ordinary Nighthawk squad, Sika Tron said in concern and doubt. Leonard smiled coldly. I'm close to advancing soon. His eyes became cold. He clenched his teeth and said to himself, I want revenge. Ince Zangwil, you must live until the day I become powerful enough. All right, Sika seemed to have guessed Leonard's thoughts. She sighed. Almost half of our team will be new faces. It's rare to see a Nighthawk team become so ravaged. Leonard's expression darkened. He clenched his teeth and asked, Are the bodies ready? Yes. Sika nodded indiscernibly. Leonard suddenly stepped towards the door. I'll notify their families. I'll deal with the scene I don't want to deal with the most. I'll do it. At 2 Daffodil Street, Melissa sat on the sofa, inspecting the 3 tickets in her hands. She was looking at the words, the printed date, and the seat numbers. Benson was sitting beside her, observing his sister with a smile. He had a relaxed posture. Suddenly, they heard the doorbell. Ding dong, ding dong. Melissa glanced at their busy maid Bella, then she took the 3 tickets with her and stood up, looking a little confused. She briskly ran to the door. Her black hair was shinier than it was before, her face no longer skinny. The color of her skin had a ruddy color, and her brown eyes looked brighter and energetic. Twisting the handle and opening the door, Melissa froze for a moment. She didn't recognize their visitor. It was a young man with black hair and green eyes. He looked handsome, but his face was unusually pale. Hidden in his eyes was deep sorrow. May I know who you are? Melissa asked, feeling somewhat lost. Leonard had specially draped a black formal coat over his white shirt. He said in a raspy voice, "I'm a colleague of your brother Klein." Melissa's heart suddenly skipped a beat. She instinctively tiptoed to look behind Leonard but didn't notice anything. She said with a strange quiver in her voice, "Where's Klein?" Leonard closed his eyes, inhaling as he said, "I'm very sorry. Your brother Klein died at the hands of an evil criminal while he was trying to save others. He's a hero, a true hero." Melissa widened her eyes slowly, her body shaking indiscernibly. The 3 tickets in her hands dropped helplessly onto the floor. The tickets faced upward, revealing the name of the play, The Return of the Count. Ellipsis. Sitting in the Moretti family's living room, Leonard didn't dare to look directly at Melissa and Benson. But he couldn't stop scenes of what they looked like from flashing through his mind. That girl filled with youthfulness and vibrancy had her eyes wide open. She didn't speak, and her eyes were unfocused. Her silence made her appear like a puppet. The man who looked a little like Klein maintained a normal posture, but he would slip into a daze from time to time. His words came out slowly. "That's the gist of the matter. I'm very sorry that I was unable to prevent it in a timely manner. The Blackthorn Security Company, the police department, and those that he helped have promised a bereavement compensation of about £6,000. Leonard said, as his eyes darted around. Suddenly, Benson interrupted him. His voice was hoarse as he asked, "Where's his body?" "I'm asking where's Klein's body?" He puckered his lips and paused. "When can we see him?" "In the company. You can see him now," Leonard answered, unable to mask his grief. "All right." Benson moved his rigid lips with great difficulty. "Let me use the bathroom first." Without waiting for Leonard's reply, he quickly entered the bathroom and slammed the door closed. He stood in front of the sink and turned on the tap, allowing the water to flow. He bent down and repeatedly splashed water onto his face. As he did that, his actions came to a sudden stop. Nothing changed for a long time, leaving only the sound of running water reverberating in the bathroom. A few minutes later, Benson lifted his head and looked into the mirror. He saw that his face was covered in water droplets. The redness in his eyes was impossible to hide now. A few days later, in a corner of the Raphael Cemetery. After finishing Dunn's funeral, the crowd gathered before a new tombstone. On it was Klein's black and white photograph, a very scholarly photograph. Melissa stood before the grave, her eyes without focus. Beside her, Elizabeth kept wiping away her tears. Leonard, Benson, Fry, and Brett carried the coffin and walked over, lowering the coffin into the grave. After the priest gave the eulogy and individual prayers, the grave was filled with soil, covering the black coffin bit by bit. At this moment, Melissa knelt down and tossed in the copper whistle she found on her brother's body. Leonard turned and looked at the scene, his heart wincing. However, he admired how strong this girl was. He knew that this girl didn't cry after receiving the bad news. Instead, she stayed pitifully quiet. The grave was leveled and a stone slab was laid over it. Leonard took a final look at Klein's tombstone. There were 3 lines to his epitaph. The best elder brother, the best younger brother, the best colleague. Under the mournful atmosphere, the members of the Blackthorn Security Company gradually left. Selina and Elizabeth also bade farewell under the urging of their families. The only people left behind were Benson and Melissa. "I'll get a rental carriage." Benson was in a terrible condition, it was as if he hadn't slept for a long time. "All right," Melissa nodded. After seeing her brother leave, she turned to look at the tombstone. She squatted down and buried her face in her arms. After some silence, Melissa suddenly scolded, "Stupid." She cried as she wept silently. Her tears just wouldn't stop. Nighttime, at the Raphael Cemetery. The copper-skinned Azek stood in front of Klein's grave holding a bouquet of white flowers. He didn't speak for the longest time until he finally sighed and muttered to himself, "I'm sorry, I was 10 minutes late. But I think I know who it was." He bent over and set the bouquet of flowers down before turning to leave the cemetery. He also left Tingen, but he didn't retrieve the copper whistle. The place was quiet and serene under the illumination of the crimson moonlight. Suddenly, the stone slab sealing the grave was flipped open. A pale hand extended out from the soil. A hand came out. Whoosh! The gravestone was shoved aside. The lid of the coffin was pushed open. Klein sat upright and looked around, lost. His memory was still frozen at the scene with the brand new leather boots, and the palm that grabbed onto the urn of St. Selina's ashes. Everything after that felt like a dreamless sleep. Klein instinctively lowered his head and unbuttoned his shirt. He looked at the left side of his chest, only to see that his ravaged injury and missing heart were squirming as they healed, similar to how he recovered from the bullet wound through his temple back when he looked into the mirror. The only difference was that this time, the recovery was much slower and much more difficult. Report chapter. In the northern part of the Loan Kingdom, the September breeze, that had an additional coldness to it, howled through the cemetery. It was even gloomier and colder than usual. The cold jolted Klein back to his senses as he muttered with a rueful smile, "It looks like there are still some secrets behind my transmigration. But it seems like I'll only be able to resurrect another 2 times at most, not any more. And if I were to minced up or completely crushed, who knows if this recovery ability that doesn't usually appear would even be useful." After half a minute, Klein buttoned his suit and realized that he was wearing his newest shirt and tuxedo, but they were now covered in soil and dirt. Benson and Melissa really have no idea how to save money. The thought popped into his head. He supported his weight on his hand and flipped up into a standing position, realizing that he still had his clown abilities. The best elder brother, the best younger brother, the best colleague. Klein looked at his tombstone and read the inscription. He felt his heart wince, seemingly sensing the despondent feelings Melissa and Benson had experienced. This is probably even more depressing than watching Captain die before my eyes. He sighed and retracted his gaze. He squatted down and closed the coffin lid. His thoughts were still scattered, but Klein knew that he had to take care of the scene as soon as possible and not let anyone notice. Resurrection wasn't something any commoner could accept. If the Nighthawks, mandated Punishers, or the machinery hivemind learned of this, Klein believed that he wouldn't have a great ending. Of course, if it was on Earth, he could deceive the people into believing that he was the Blessed One of God, the man of salvation, had he consumed the lawyer or swindler potions. However, in the world he was in, there was a real God that could respond to rituals. He scraped the soil back together and covered it with the stone slab. Klein clapped his hands and stood up once again. At that moment, the scene didn't appear strange. He was just like a gentleman who came to offer his condolences late at night. The only oddity was that the person in the photo on the tombstone looked exactly like him. During the process of filling his grave, his spirituality noticed the existence of Azek's copper whistle. Hence, he dug it out and wiped it clean. However, Klein didn't intend to summon the messenger immediately. He decided to figure out the situation first. Klein lifted his left hand and saw the topaz pendant that was still wrapped around his wrist. "I guess this is considered a burial object?" He gave a self-deprecating laugh and took off the pendulum. He looked around, and his face grew solemn. "Captain should be buried in this cemetery as well, I guess." He changed directions twice and finally determined the location of Dunn's tombstone using the pendulum. With the moonlight's aid, Klein walked around and searched for about 15 minutes until he finally saw Captain's monochrome photo. It had a gentle expression, high hairline, gray eyes, nothing unusual compared to before. Under Dunn's photo was his name, date of birth, date of death, and epitaph. The true guardian, the most trusted partner, the captain forever. Klein looked in stunned silence and somehow his sight grew blurry for some baffling reason. He felt as though he had returned to that day again. He saw the captain turn his head to him and wink. He spoke with a mellow and relaxed voice. "We saved Tingen, Captain," Klein shouted in silence. He stood there like a statue for a good few minutes until he suddenly said with a smile, "Captain, your mental state was definitely not the best that day. You even said things like you could bring old Neil into the dreamland if he hadn't lost control. He was a mystery prior, and you're a nightmare. You couldn't consume the Beyonder characteristic that he left behind. Yes. You didn't ask me what powerful offensive attacks I had. Was it trust, or did you forget about it? But, you definitely guessed something. I only took one sealed artifact and said it was for Leonard. Even without a brain, you could have guessed that I had the extra means for a powerful attack." Having said that, Klein paused, then he shook his head and sighed. "I have no idea what I am now. Maybe I'm just an evil spirit that has clawed its way back from hell to seek revenge." As he spoke, he suddenly stopped. His tears streamed down his cheeks and finally, he shouted softly with a choking voice, "Captain. We miss you too." Klein felt the cold breeze blow past him as he lifted his hands to wipe his tears and blow his nose. He became silent again and found a hidden spot nearby. He took 4 steps counterclockwise and entered the world above the gray fog. He wanted to find the person that killed him with the aid of divination. He wanted to know the murderer who triggered all of this. "As he's already appeared before me, I'm sure that I can divine some information." Klein pursed his lips tightly together and saw the lofty palace and ancient mottled table as usual. He took the seat that belonged to the fool. A yellowish-brown goatskin and fountain pen appeared before him. Since his physical body in reality was under limited protection, Klein didn't delay and wrote down his divination statement after a moment's thought. The person who killed me. He recited it 7 times and leaned back into the chair. He entered his dream with the aid of cogitation. In the blurry world, there were countless points of light dancing and gathering. In the end, they formed a scene. A pair of brand new leather boots, a pair of slightly pale hands, and the St. Selena's urn that was held by those hands. He looked up, and Klein saw a middle-aged man with short, dark blonde hair. He wore a black 2-button suit, and one of his eyes was obviously blind while the other one was so blue that it was almost black. His facial features were like carvings, and his face had no wrinkles at all. The image shattered and Klein woke up from his dream. His eyebrows were tightly knitted. He found his murderer very familiar. As a seer, he quickly understood why he found the person familiar. It was because he had seen the man's photo on a wanted notice. The murderer was Ince Zangwill. He was the former archbishop of the Church of the Evernight Goddess who took sealed artifact 008. He had failed to advance as a gatekeeper. It's him. Countless images flashed through Klein's head, and they finally stopped on the scene when Ince Zangwill picked up St. Selena's urn. Tap, tap, tap. Klein extended his hands and rapped the edge of the long bronze table. He felt that he suddenly understood many things. The captain said that a Beyonder that dies normally would leave behind a Beyonder characteristic. When gathered together, they're equivalent to a potion that lacks the supplementary ingredients. In other words, as long as one knows the corresponding supplementary ingredients, they can advance using remains. Of course, one cannot consume beyond their level, as it would easily lead to a loss of control or going insane. Becoming a high-sequence Beyonder would require the accompaniment of some special ritual. That was mentioned in the incomplete unshadowed formula. The subsequent advancements would require a ritual as well. Ince Zangwill is a gatekeeper, a sequence 5 from the death sequence pathway. He wanted to become a high-sequence Beyonder, a demigod. Based on the situation allowed by the exchanging of sequences, he had 3 choices. One was obviously sequence 4 in the death sequence pathway, second was sequence 4 in the sleepless sequence pathway, and third was sequence 4 in the god of combat sequence pathway, Demon Hunter. Saint Selena was a saint. She was either sequence 4 or sequence 3. Her urn corresponds to one of the 2 sequence potions. Ince Zangwill, who was a former archbishop, definitely knew exactly which one she was, and he definitely knew the required supplementary ingredients. Was his true motive in planning all of this to get St. Selena's ashes and advance to sequence 4 in the sleepless pathway? The skull of Death's descendant, that might be an ingredient needed for the special ritual. It was from the death sequence pathway, after all. From the looks of it, his target was the captain, and not me. He really was the mastermind behind all this. Having figured this out, Klein wrote down a corresponding divination statement. He took his pendulum and let the topaz hang above the surface of the paper. After he recited the statement, he opened his eyes and saw the topaz pendant spinning clockwise. It meant that the information he provided was sufficient, and the divination was successful. It meant that Ince Zangwill had really plotted the series of events in order to get St. Selena's ashes, to advance to sequence 4. Klein rapped on the edge of the table again as he mulled over a different question. Ince Zangwill was merely a sequence 5 gatekeeper. Relying on him alone would make it impossible for him to create so many coincidences. For instance, for Megos to follow his arrangements, and visit the Nighthawks at the correct time. So, is it the power of sealed artifact 008? Its appearance is that of an ordinary quill. Its function is to write down events that are bound to happen? No, it couldn't be that easy. Otherwise, Ince Zangwill could write that St. Selena's urn grew a pair of wings and flew into his hands. Then, he could have just waited at home. There must be certain restrictions. 008 most likely doesn't possess direct combat ability. Otherwise, Ince Zangwill could have stormed through Channy's Gate in Tingen. As one of the most dangerous sealed artifacts, perhaps it can let people act according to its description without realizing it? That was the reason behind all the coincidences? If that's really true, then 008 is quite terrifying. Even Megos, who was pregnant with the son of an evil god, adhered to its arrangements. No wonder Grade 0 sealed artifacts are extremely dangerous. They're of the highest importance and of the highest confidentiality. They're not to be inquired, disseminated, described, or spied. Klein stopped rapping the edge of the table. He divined his earlier guess, but, unfortunately, it failed due to a lack of information. He saw that a few minutes had passed, and he planned to return to the real world as soon as possible. Hence, he didn't let his thoughts run wild but wrote down the penultimate divination statement. The city where Ince Zangul currently is. Due to the existence of sealed artifact 008 and the fact that Ince Zangul had likely become a demigod, Klein couldn't divine his exact location directly. He could only make a rough inquiry of the general area. Of course, if there wasn't a mysterious space like the world above the grey fog to eliminate disturbances, he would definitely fail in divination, even if it was a rough inquiry. He leaned against the high back chair and recited the divination statement 7 times. He dreamed again and entered the blurry world. The blurry world suddenly cracked, and there was a wide river which was slightly murky. There was a grand bridge above the river. Both banks had ports lined one after another. There were many goods and many workers. To the northeast of the river, there were rows upon rows of houses. Most of them had the Loan Kingdom's present-day architectural styles, such as polygenic roofs, oriel windows, and no veranda by the street. Other than that, there was a lot of Gothic architecture. The streets were filled with people and carriages. From time to time, strange machinery could be seen. The farther east he went, the more chimneys there were and the smokier it got. When he headed west, the elevation rose, and there were houses in grayish-blue, beige, and light yellow that spiraled up opulent castles and Gothic clock towers. Gong! The chime of a clock sounded and snapped Klein back to his senses. He knew which city he had seen. The Land of Hope, and the City of Cities, Baklan. So Ince Zangul has gone to Baklan. I wonder how long he'll stay there. Yes, I should confirm this every now and then. Klein leaned forward as he thought. He erased the contents on the goatskin and wrote a new divination statement, Lenivus's current location. From his point of view, the person that caused the captain and him to nearly die was undoubtedly Ince Zangul, but the lunatic Lenivus was definitely an accomplice who cannot shirk from the responsibility. He had to pay the price in blood. After reciting the statement 7 times, Klein once again entered the dream. But the scene that appeared after the foggy world shattered was the same as the one he had seen before. A wide, slightly murky river, countless piers and buildings. The buildings were primarily in the present Loan architectural style, some a little more Gothic. There were crowded streets, flourishing sites, chimneys that continually spewed smoke. There were opulent castles standing tall with the trademark Gothic clock towers. Lenivus was also in the Land of Hope, the City of Cities, Baklan. Klein opened his eyes, a little confused. He had divined for Lenivus's specific location, but the results were still a very general, vague region. This tells me that Lenivus's sequence must be much higher than I imagined. No, it could also be that he's received a large benefit from helping the son of the true creator descend upon this world. For example, a little godhood characteristics, or some objects similar to the placenta left behind by Migos's baby. The latter would most likely have been taken away by Ince Zangul. Thoughts ran through Klein's mind as he muttered to himself whilst he made initial assumptions. After confirming the rough area where both his enemies were, he thought about another problem. He still didn't have the ability to exact revenge. Even if Lenivus is only a sequence 7, or even 8, it wouldn't be easy to deal with him if he did indeed receive a large benefit. Lenivus is also obviously very crafty, he could outwit and defeat Beyonders more powerful than himself. Ince Zangul is even more terrifying. He's a sequence 4 demigod, and he wields a powerful grade 0 sealed artifact. Although there were some secrets surrounding my transmigration, it's clear that I can't convert those secrets into combat strength. It's likely that it's not possible for a very long period of time. The only means that I have are to continue raising my sequence, or I could collect even more powerful mystical items. I have to use both the methods at the same time. In between his thoughts, Klein decided to add another divination. He deliberated on the statement before writing solemnly, "My opportunities of becoming powerful." He gently placed the pen on the table and leaned back, then he closed his eyes. He recited the statement silently and fell into a deep sleep with the help of cogitation. In the foggy world, he once again saw the scene that he had previously seen. The river, piers, chimneys, crowds, castles, various machinery, and Gothic clock towers. He had once again seen the capital of the Loan Kingdom, Baklan. Immediately following that, the scene changed. He saw a magnificent peak piercing through the clouds, and, on it, he saw a majestic, ancient palace. He saw the giant throne carved from stone, adorned with dull gems and gold. He saw a strange vertical pupil formed from countless mysterious symbols. The scene shattered silently without warning. Klein slowly sat up and tapped on the edge of the table with his fingers. Backland contains the opportunities for me to become powerful. Does the second scene refer to the main peak of the Hornassus mountain range, the treasures left behind by the Antigonus family? The strange vertical pupil formed by countless mysterious symbols which the misfortune cloth puppet conveyed to me through the corruption from the Antigonus family's notebook is the key to beginning all of this. Many thoughts flashed through his mind. Klein decided that he was in no rush to visit the Hornassus mountain range. Even a Sequence 4 demigod might not be able to deal with the dangers that resided there. I guess I'll head to Backland first. Klein sighed and made a decision. He enveloped himself with spirituality and stimulated a descent, exiting the mysterious space above the gray fog. When he returned to the material world, he slowly walked out of his hiding spot towards Dunsmith's grave. He stared deeply at the picture and epitaph. Klein slowly drew a crimson moon on his chest and walked out of the cemetery. As a former Nighthawk, a Nighthawk who had to regularly patrol Raphael Cemetery, he was quite familiar with the routes of the guards, as well as its surroundings. He managed to leave the cemetery easily, without causing any alarm. He followed the gravel road into Tingen, using the shade of the trees as cover. The night was peaceful and the moon was ever so dreamy. Klein walked alone, his thoughts running wild and unbridled. He sometimes considered his plan for revenge, sometimes thinking back to the times he spent with the captain, sometimes recalling old Neil's hidden grief beneath his humorous facade. Unknowingly, Klein had entered the nearest street like a wandering ghost, making his way past turn after turn. It was 2 hours later when he freed himself from that state and regained complete control of his thoughts. He realized that he was standing on Daffodil Street. Opposite him was the house he shared with his brother and sister. Instinctively, Klein had returned here. He took a step forward with clear joy, but suddenly paused. He let out a bitter smile and muttered with a self-deprecating tone, "If I went up and knocked on the door, Melissa might faint from shock. Benson would be so nervous his hair would start to drop. He would then try his best to calmly convince me, in the name of a curly-haired baboon." Shaking his head, Klein stared at the familiar door for a while before heading towards Iron Cross Street. This is fine too. The things that I do in the future will not implicate them. The compensation given to them by the Nighthawks team and the police department will be enough for them to live a stable middle-class life, even if Melissa fails to find a job and Benson loses his job. Klein walked silently for a moment before starting to feel fatigue. But, as someone who was dead, he didn't have any other belongings on him except for the clothes he was wearing, his topaz pendulum, and Azek's copper whistle. He didn't have pounds, nor soldi, nor pennies. Should I give the whistle a blow to send a letter to Mr. Azek and get him to help me? Klein laughed optimistically. Forget it, I shouldn't contact him for the time being. Perhaps Ince Zangwill is still keeping him under surveillance. I'll look for him when the time is right. To an old monster who has lived countless lives for thousands of years, he should be able to understand resurrection. At least it's not too cold tonight. I'll make do by finding a place to sleep for the time being and head to the Tingen branch of the Backland Bank tomorrow morning to retrieve the money in the anonymous account. As there had been too many things to do lately, Klein hadn't had the time to start on the experiments involving the sacrificial ritual. He hadn't touched the £300 in the anonymous account either. That should be enough to support my expenses for quite a while. I'll buy a newspaper tomorrow to confirm what day it is. Miss Justice and the others didn't make any new prayers, which means that I didn't miss a gathering. Klein thought as he found a spot that had no wind. He sat down and took off his jacket. He used it as a blanket and leaned on the wall to sleep. It wasn't long into his sleep when he was suddenly woken by someone. He saw a policeman wielding a baton. He only had a single chevron on his epaulette, the lowest-ranking police constable. Klein glanced at him to ascertain his identity. The policeman said fiercely, "You can't sleep here. The streets and parks aren't for you lazy, jobless vagrants to sleep in. Those are the terms in the poor law." "Is that so?" Klein froze. Given his sensitive identity, he didn't argue with the policeman. He grabbed his jacket and continued walking until daybreak. Soon after, he lowered his head and entered the Tingen branch of the Backland Bank. He took out £200 with the password he had set, leaving behind a third of the money as savings, in case of any emergencies. Without a doubt, Klein heard prayers when he wrote the password in ancient Hermes. Klein then spent £38 on 2 sets of formal wear, 2 shirts, 2 trousers, 2 pairs of leather boots, 2 bow ties, 4 pairs of socks, as well as 2 thick double-breasted jackets, 2 solid-colored fur coats, and 2 pairs of thick trousers in preparation for the winter. He also bought a cane, a wallet, and a leather luggage bag. After completing his purchase, Klein found a hotel to wash up and change in. He rented a private carriage directly to the train station in Tingen in order to avoid meeting anyone familiar. Along the way, he purchased a newspaper and discovered that it was Sunday. It took about 4 hours to get from Tingen to Backlund by train. A luxurious first-class seat cost about £0.75, or 15 soldi. A second-class seat cost 10 soldi, or half a pound. The packed, poorly maintained third-class seats were rather cheap at only 5 soldi. Klein thought for a moment before buying a seat for the 2 o'clock train, a second-class seat. Klein found a random spot to sit in the waiting area with his ticket and luggage in hand. It was only slightly after 9 in the morning. He was happy that the Lowen Kingdom didn't have a strict census. He could prove his identity just by using the water and gas bills, as well as his rent for the past 3 months. Purchasing a train ticket was even easier, as all he needed was money. Klein suddenly had an empty feeling in his heart as he was sitting there, thinking about how he was about to leave for Backlund from Tingen in the afternoon. He thought about his sister who always gave him a motherly vibe. He thought about his brother who liked to crack cold jokes. He thought about how they would fill their stomachs up so much that they wouldn't feel like moving. Recalling these scenes, Klein suddenly laughed. He laughed bitterly, for he thought about the tortoise that Melissa called a puppet, as well as Benson's pitiful hairline. He suddenly had a strong urge. He wanted to see his siblings again. At this moment, Klein suddenly realized why he hadn't picked an earlier train but instead bought a ticket for the 2 o'clock train. He carried his luggage and left the waiting area quickly, taking a rented carriage back to Daffodil Street. He then hid in a shady area on the opposite side and looked at the door to his house. There were many times when he felt like heading over, but he couldn't bring himself to cross the wide street. Klein looked across the road in a daze, suddenly having a feeling of homelessness. He'd had a similar feeling when he had just transmigrated. Suddenly, he saw the door to the house open as Melissa and Benson came out. Melissa was wearing a black dress and black veiled hat. Benson was in a shirt, vest, trousers, coat, and hat, all in black. They both had numb, sullen expressions. Melissa has become skinnier. Why is Benson so haggard? Klein's heart winced in pain. He opened his mouth but couldn't shout out their names. Without realizing it, he followed Benson and Melissa to the nearest municipal square. He saw that tents had been erected there again. A new circus troupe was in town for a performance. Benson took out some money and purchased the entrance tickets and led Melissa into the circus. He forced a smile. This circus troupe is very famous. Melissa nodded without expression. Okay. Suddenly, she slipped and almost fell. Klein, who was also buying a ticket, opened his mouth. He wanted to help his sister, but he could only retract the hand he had instinctively extended and stood helplessly in the busy crowd. Benson jumped in fright, but he was too late to help. However, Melissa quickly steadied herself. She puckered her lips and said nothing. At this moment, clowns swarmed forward, some performing balancing acts on wheels or large rubber balls, others tossing countless tennis balls into the air, then ridiculously catching every one of them. Melissa seemed to disregard the clowns as she looked at the performance. Benson tried to lift his sister's spirits by cheering, but he didn't succeed. He slowly turned sullen too. Klein puckered his lips tightly as he watched this scene from afar. He wanted to approach them, but he didn't dare to. Suddenly, he touched the wallet in his jacket and had an idea. Benson and Melissa continued walking forward, silently watching the various performances. Some time later, they saw a clown running towards them. His face was painted in colorful pastels. At first, he threw a tennis ball into the air, and, while the attention of the surrounding people was drawn to the air, he conjured a flower out of thin air. It was a Seville chrysanthemum. The clown brought the flower before Melissa and Benson. The flower was golden in color and symbolized happiness. Melissa and Benson looked at the clown in a daze. All they saw was a wide smile plastered over the pastel face. It was a happy smile, an exaggerated smile, a ridiculous smile. Choo-choo. A train whistle resounded in every corner of the station as a metal behemoth, in the form of a steam locomotive, came to a slow stop with more than 20 carriages in tow. Dressed in a tuxedo and half-top hat, Klein was carrying an exaggerated luggage bag that appeared incongruent with his figure. He took a firm step onto the ground of the Lowen Kingdom's capital, Backlund. This city was divided into 2 regions by the Tussock River which flowed to the southeast. The 2 lands were connected by the Backlund Bridge and ferries, with a population exceeding 5 million people. It was the most prosperous capital in the southern and northern continents. Klein looked far into the distance and saw faint yellow hazes everywhere. Visibility was terrible, and the gas lamps hanging above the train platform were already lit to dispel the gloominess and darkness. It's only 6:30? It looks like it's 9 or 10. Klein shook his head indiscernibly. Suddenly, he recalled a joke he read on the Tussock Times. A gentleman who just arrived in Backland finds himself lost in the thick haze. Helpless, he asks a drenched gentleman passing him by, "How do you get to the Tussock River?" The gentleman answers him in a friendly manner, "Walk straight without stopping. I just swam from there less than sup greater than 1 less than sup greater than." Every time I read Backland newspapers or magazines, the reporters and editors will make a mockery of the polluted air or the increasing number of foggy days in every conceivable way possible. Previously, the Backland Daily Tribune even did the statistics, and it was found that it has gone from about 60 days a year from 30 years ago to the present 75 days a year. For this, many far-sighted people established organizations like the Soot Reduction Association, Smoke Reduction Association. Apparently, there was a bill in September that motioned the need to establish the National Atmospheric Pollution Council. Klein lowered his huge luggage bag and pinched his nose to gain respite from the sudden discomfort. Then, tracing his golden chain, he fished out a golden pocket watch from his vest pocket. He popped it open and looked at the time. When he truly bade farewell to his siblings, he had especially visited a department store and spent £4.10 solely to buy a golden pocket watch and matched it with a golden chain worth £1.5 solely. To not constantly be aware of the exact time made him feel a sense of horror. Klein had planned on buying a silver pocket watch as he felt it matched his temperament. But after considering the true essence of a clown, he finally chose a more showy and exaggerated golden watch. 6:39. It's not that much later. Klein put away his pocket watch and held his cane and luggage bag as he slowly walked out the steam locomotive station with the crowd. Suddenly, he made a sudden turn, causing a person who was secretly tailing him to have his hand fall empty when reaching for his pocket. Klein was unfazed by this episode as he followed the cement-paved road and mixed into the crowd, arriving at an intersection in front of him. There was a lawn and garden that circled around a column that resembled a chimney. No, it's very likely a chimney. Klein saw the column spewing thick smoke from its top end. A portion of the smoke floated high into the sky as a portion condensed into tiny liquid droplets that scattered everywhere. Klein paused once again and placed his luggage down. He spread open the newspaper and map that he had held onto using his other hand. While on the steam locomotive, he had already planned where he was going to go or what to do next. The experiences that he had undergone, and the mental experience that he had, when disguised as a clown in the morning, made Klein finally understand the true essence of a clown. Although being capable of knowing a little about fate, one remains helpless towards fate. Therefore, one might as well use a smiling face to hide all the pain, sorrow, confusion, and depression. At that moment, he clearly felt the clown potion digest, and believed that if he continued acting this way, it wouldn't take long for him to make another attempt at advancing. But herein lay the problem: he didn't know the corresponding name of the Sequence 7 potion, much less know its exact formula. How should I obtain the formula? The secret order seldom appears. They only seem to be interested in the Antigonus family's items. This is also why others have little understanding of them. Yes, I should consider 2 aspects. 1. I need to come into contact with the local Beyonder circles and see if I can find clues. 2. I should set a trap and use the Antigonus family's treasure as bait to lure the secret order out. After all, I do possess knowledge of the strange vertical pupil formed from the numerous mysterious symbols. But that's too risky. I need to be careful since the bait cannot be too good or too bad. It won't garner their interest if it's too bad, and if it's too good, I might end up attracting a shark that can swallow me whole. The secret order's leader, Zaratul, is a figure who guided Emperor Russell. Maybe he had obtained the biggest slice of the pie during that revolutionary feast. Of course, he might not still be alive as that was something from 200 years ago. Amidst his thoughts, Klein felt the coldness of Backland and couldn't help but shiver. He decided to find a residence as soon as possible. He flipped through the papers and, once again, browsed through the rental section and saw a circled advertisement. 15 Minsk Street, Sherwood Borough, Terrace House. Weekly rent of 18 solely. Klein had thought this through very carefully about the area in which he was to stay in. Although Backland had a population exceeding 5 million people, he still needed to be wary about meeting the local Nighthawks. Be it the newly transferred Daly or Larota, Ior Harson, and Borgia that he previously met, they would definitely be able to recognize him. Therefore, Klein eliminated the North Borough where the Church of the Evernight Goddesses Backland Diocese's headquarters and St. Samuel Cathedral, was. He also eliminated areas with the best security and the extremely strictly monitored Empress Borough and Western Borough. These two boroughs belonged to the nobles and the richest magnates, with more of the nobles living closer to Empress Borough. After eliminating the worker areas, the harbour, and the East Borough and Backland Bridge region where the poor gathered, Klein had few choices left. The first choice was Hillston Backland where the Backland Stock Exchange, Clearing House, Futures Center, the 7 major banks' headquarters, various trust funds, rail companies, and bulk cargo commerce companies were. It was known as the financial, business, and economic center of the Lowan Kingdom. The second choice was Sherwood Borough where there were many small companies and residential buildings. The two boroughs had a lot of people in them, and the security was relatively good. It was good for hiding in. After serious consideration, Klein chose the cheaper Sherwood Borough. The reason why he didn't seek out organizations like the Capital Housing Improvement Company or Capital Housing Improvement Association was due to the fact that they needed identification which he couldn't produce at the moment. If I can't find a place to rent today, I'll find a motel that doesn't need any identification to stay for the night. Klein gathered the things in his hand and carried his luggage. According to the map, he walked towards what seemed like a department store's entrance. That was the Backland Metro's entrance. Yes, a metro. The first time Klein saw the word metro on the newspapers and magazines, he nearly jumped in fright. He never expected that such a transportation vehicle had become a reality in this era which hadn't entered the age of electricity. It was born 25 years ago. It first connected both banks of the Tussock River and had now expanded to the key city boroughs. Of course, there weren't many stations. Through the main door, Klein followed the people ahead of him as he walked to the ticketing booth. After being in line for a few minutes, he finally saw a cashier with a head with beautiful golden hair. The lady didn't raise her head. All she did was point at the wooden board by the side of the window with the prices. Peak period, 7 a.m. to 9 a.m., 6 p.m. to 8 p.m., 10-minute headway. 15-minute headway for all other times. First class seat, 6 pence second class seat, 4 pence third class seat, 3 pence. Return trips are respectively 9, 6, 5 pence. Annual pass first class, £8 second class, £5.10 solely third class. No annual pass, it's cheaper than I imagine. There's actually no distance restriction. Melissa would definitely love this more than a horse carriage. This is the culmination of machinery. Klein thought as he suddenly felt upset. He revealed a brilliant smile and fished out 4 pence and handed it to the cashier. Second class seat. Smack. The cashier tore a ticket and stamped it before handing it to Klein. After finding the line that led to Sherwood Borough and passing through the not very strict security checks, Klein went down the flight of stairs and quickly came to the platform. He followed the labels on the ground and found the corresponding location for second-class seats. Choo-choo. He didn't wait long before he heard the chugging sound of the train and the thunderous steam whistle. He saw a huge steam locomotive, its large and meandering body, together with its black metallic luster and complex machinery, mixed together to form a unique beauty. Backland's metro still used steam locomotives. The smoke that they spewed was specially designed to enter a pipe above and travel through a chimney, out into the world. This was also the true usage for the lawn and garden out on the streets. Amidst the screeching sound of metal, Klein first waited for the passengers to alight before carrying his cane and luggage over slowly. He then allowed the conductor to check his tickets. Unlike the third-class seats, the second-class seats were one person to a seat, so there were no concerns about having one seat snatched. Just as Klein sat down, stowed away his luggage, and leaned on his cane, he suddenly heard hurried footsteps. He subconsciously looked towards the door and saw a thin, adolescent boy rush into the carriage. The boy was wearing a coat that didn't suit his age. He wore a rounded top hat and carried a ragged haversack. He kept his head very low. "I'm sorry. I got on the wrong carriage. I'm from third class." He showed his ticket and apologized to the passengers before briskly walking towards the third-class carriage. Klein retracted his gaze and once again confirmed his destination as he waited for the doors to the carriage to close. At that moment, he heard chaotic and hurried footsteps. He then saw a few men dressed in black coats and half-top hats rush into the carriage. Are they chasing after that 15-year-old boy? Klein instinctively had such a thought. He shook his head gently and continued reading his newspapers and map, just like the other passengers on board the carriage. Did you see a teenage boy? He's wearing an old coat. One of the men who dashed into the carriage asked the conductor fiercely. Klein glanced at the man through the corner of his eyes. He was thin and hardy, his skin a dark shade from prolonged exposure to the sun. His eyes were much more recessed than the typical Lowen Kingdom citizen. A Highlander? Or a mixed blood? He nodded thoughtfully. In the middle of the northern continent, the point where the Hornassus mountain range began, there was a highland which was extremely hot and dry. Most of it belonged under the Fenapodar kingdom, while the area west belonged to the Intis Republic. The area to the east belonged to the Lowen kingdom. Its natives were thin and barbarians, but they were brave and skillful in warfare. A long time ago, they posed as one of the biggest problems for the three nations. But with the advancement of gunpowder, and the changes in the way war was carried out, these Highlanders eventually recognized reality and submitted. A large number of them left the highlands and entered Backland, Trier, Fenapodar City, and the various flourishing cities or ports in the northern continent. Some were workers, while others became grunts of the local triads. They dared to kill and showed no fear of thorny situations. The conductor was a man in his 20s. He shrank back when he heard that as he pointed in the direction of the third-class carriage. I saw him. He went that way. The leader, wearing a black coat and half-top hat, nodded indiscernibly. He led his men and rushed to the third-class carriage and showed no concern towards the surrounding passengers. If I were that boy, I would have already alighted from the third-class carriage. As Klein read his newspaper, he began letting his thoughts stray. About a minute later, the train whistled as the carriage doors closed. Chug, chug, the steam metro began speeding up as it cruised along. But at that moment, Klein suddenly sensed something as he looked up to see the door leading to the other second-class carriages. The teenage boy walked slowly into the carriage wearing his old coat and round-top hat while carrying a ragged haversack. He looked adolescent and had refined facial features. His red eyes were staid and solemn. Impressive. He alighted from the third-class carriage and circled around to enter from the first-class carriage again? Was he afraid that his pursuers had partners waiting inside the metro station? Klein was slightly surprised. He felt that the boy's handling of the situation was rather mature and careful. He was much better than most people in their 20s. He clicked this left molar lightly and secretly activated his spirit vision. He scanned the boy and saw that he was in a state of fatigue. His emotions were tense and he was dispirited. However, he still maintained a blueness that represented calm thinking. Impressive, at his age. Klein mumbled silently as he lowered his head and continued reading his papers. The boy didn't notice that he had been scrutinized by a Beyander as he headed for the third-class carriage once again. The rest of the journey happened stably and calmly. Klein arrived 20 minutes later at one of the 3 train stations in Sherwood Borough. He took a rented carriage for nearly 10 minutes before finding Minsk Street. According to the descriptions in the papers, he came to Unit 17, which was next to Unit 15, and pulled the doorbell. Cuckoo, cuckoo. As sounds reverberated inside the house, a mechanical bird that didn't look too fancy popped out from above the door. It was about the size of a palm and was made up of gears and other parts. It constantly nodded its head and let out the sound of a cuckoo bird. Not a bad toy. It's just not very well crafted. Klein made an objective assessment. Nearly 20 seconds later, the dark door was pulled open. A young maidservant dressed in white and black looked warily at Klein and asked, "May I help you?" Klein smiled and waved his cane, which was now wrapped with the newspapers. "I'm here to find Mrs. Sammer about renting a house. I'm guessing it hasn't been rented out?" The full name on the newspaper was Stellan Sammer. "Not at all. Please wait a moment." The maidservant bent her back politely. She rushed inside and reported to her mistress. Moments later, she came out again and ushered him in. She then helped him place his cane and luggage in the foyer and hung his coat and hat on a clothes rack in the same place. A warm blast of air inundated him, dispersing the chill Klein had brought in. He scanned the area and first saw a uniquely designed fireplace. He saw pieces of red, smokeless charcoal burning inside. Sammer's living room was rather big. It was nearly equivalent to the entire Moretti's first floor in area. Certain areas were decorated with carpets or oil paintings of beautiful sceneries. The maidservant brought Klein to the sofa and said to her mistress in a pale yellow dress, "Madam, the guest is here." The mistress was in her 30s. She had blonde hair and blue eyes. She looked rather pretty and had preserved her youthfulness well. She held a silver inlaid feathered royal fan in her hand. As she was at home, and the fireplace made for a warm environment, she didn't wear anything around her neck, revealing her white bosom and shiny long neck. "Hello there, Mrs. Sammer." Klein pressed one palm to his chest and bowed. Mrs. Sammer smiled in a reserved manner. Good evening. Please, have a seat. Do you wish for some coffee or tea? Klein sat on the sofa and answered frankly, tea, please. Julienne, Marquis black tea, instructed Mrs. Sammer. She then turned her eyes to Klein and asked, how might I address you? Sherlock Moriarty. You can call me Sherlock. Klein had long thought of a fake name. At that moment, he caught a whiff of a fragrance from the kitchen and saw complicated pipes. Those are my husband's designs. Although his actual job is a manager at the Coim Company, he's a machinery enthusiast. He's also a member of the Kingdom's Soot Reduction Association. Mrs. Sammer noticed Klein's gaze and explained with a smile. Mrs., there's no need to go into such detail. I'm not here on a blind date with your husband. Klein lampooned as he said without his smile waning, Mrs. Sammer, I wish to rent the Unit 15. Mrs. Sammer straightened her back as she sat elegantly. She said with a smile, I have to remind you of certain things. Unit 15 doesn't have such pipes, reclining chairs, card tables, mahogany kitchen cabinets, fine porcelain, silver cutlery, gold-plated tea sets, or removable carpets. She pointed at the things in her house as she introduced them, one after another. After she was done, she added, it originally belonged to my elder sister and brother-in-law, but due to a business failure, my brother-in-law had no choice but to move to the southern continent. They have a plantation at Balam. However, I don't agree with their choice. This is just too unfair for my niece and nephew. There are no good grammar schools there, not even a good home tutor. Mrs., that's not something I would like to know. Klein nodded sincerely and said, apart from the weather, there's no place in the southern continent that can compare with Backland. His agreement satisfied Mrs. Sammer greatly as her eyes darted slightly. This house still has a 3 years lease. I wish for you to pay a year's rent at once. 18 soldi a week. The use of the furniture will cost 1 soldi. I can collect a deposit of £50. Klein shook his head and smiled. Mrs. Sammer, you should be able to tell that I just arrived in Backland. I don't know what will happen to me in time. To pay £50 for a deposit will lower my ability to resist any risks. My limit is half a year. £25. He still planned on renting another one-bedroom apartment in Backland's East Borough. He would use it to change his clothes, undergo disguises, and shirk off any tailing. It was necessary for what he planned to do. Stellan nodded slightly and asked, have you studied at grammar school? Klein chuckled and said, yes, I later self-studied history. Do you have any identification with you? Asked Stellan casually. I'm sorry. I was in a hurry when I left home and forgot to bring it with me. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm from Midseashire. Klein deliberately used the accent his classmate, Welch, often used. When he said, forgot, it reminded him of Captain Dunn Smith. The smile on his face turned even more brilliant. At this moment, the maidservant, Julienne, brought a cup of black tea over. The cup was porcelain white with classic flowery patterns. Some areas were plated in gold. Klein took a sip and found the fragrance distant. The mix of sourness and sweetness were perfect, and it was clearly much better than the sea black tea he often drank. Very authentic Marquis black tea. He complimented with a description which couldn't be faulted. Mrs. Stellan Sammer curled her lips and said, then, let's do half a year's rent. £25. Klein thanked her and engaged in a few minutes of idle chatter with her until another maidservant found a service contract from the study. After both parties signed the contract, Klein counted £25 while feeling the pinch and pushed it to Mrs. Sammer. Stellan counted it silently before smiling. Mr. Moriarty, I believe you'll be finding a job in Backland? Yes, Klein answered, feeling a little lost. The corners of Stellan's mouth hooked up. I can give you some suggestions. With a weekly salary lower than £3, it would be difficult for you to live in Sherwood Borough. Your rent, food expenses, water, gas, and charcoal expenses, transport expenses, and everything else added up will cost at least £2.5 soldi. Believe me, this is Backland. One still has to consider new clothes and good cutlery and tea sets. A weekly salary of £3 is the bare minimum. If your weekly salary reaches £5, you can hire a maidservant. At £6, you can consider hiring a chef. At £7, you can add a male servant. For £8, you can hire an additional maidservant. Mrs. Sammer, I think you are flaunting your wealth. I once earned more than £10 a week. Klein maintained his smile as he listened attentively. At that moment, the door suddenly opened. A stout man walked in. He was dressed in a black double-breasted suit and leather gloves of the same color. Above his lips were two elegant mustaches. "Luke, this is Mr. Moriarty. He will be our neighbor." Stellan Sammer went forward and introduced him. Obviously the master of the house, Luke took off his coat and handed it to the male servant beside him. He smiled politely and said, "Mr. Moriarty, would you like to join us for dinner? This is the manager of some coin company, a member of the Lowen Kingdom's Soot Reduction Association." Klein said with a smile, "I'm very sorry, Mr. Sammer. I've eaten on the steam locomotive. Although, that taste does leave a deep impression on one." After exchanging some pleasantries, Klein was led by Julien out of the house and into the neighboring Unit 15. The layout was very similar to the unit next door. The first floor had a huge living room, a dining room with decent lighting, 2 guest rooms, a bathroom, a cellar, a kitchen that extended all the way back. On the second floor, there were 4 bedrooms, an activity room, a solarium, a study, 2 bedrooms, and a huge balcony. "Mrs. Sammer wishes to tell you that you can rent out part of it, but not to workers or make this place too packed or noisy." "Oh, I'll bring you clean blankets, sheets, and pillowcases in a while." Julien returned to the Sammers after informing Klein. After doing a round of packing, Klein finally settled into Backland. He sat in an empty living room and suddenly felt lonely. Hence, he forced himself to consider his future plans. Whether he liked it or not, revenge and advancement couldn't be done in the blink of an eye. Therefore, he had to obtain a lucrative job to prevent himself from facing any financial problems. However, the job couldn't restrict him and affect his movements and plans. In other words, he needed sufficient freedom. After some deliberation and eliminating unsuitable jobs, Klein was left with 3 choices. He could become an author by becoming a plagiarist. However, his identity was sensitive, so the more famous he became, the more trouble it meant. All he could do was give up unwillingly. The second choice was to be a news reporter. This was considered quite a decent job in this time and age. However, job applications required his educational certificates and other documents. Klein was helpless in that respect. Finally, he chose the third job, private detective. This was also the reason why he had taken on a fake name. Klein started his first morning in Backland under cold and humid weather conditions, with a light fog that provided very little visibility. For breakfast, he had 1 liter worth of cheap tea, costing 1 penny, and 2 pieces of toast with inferior butter in the center. He was busy the entire morning, but he first went to the Sherwood Burrows Backland Bulletin to post a tiny advertisement for a month at the cost of £30. From Tuesday, the Backland Bulletin's loyal readers would see a tiny advertisement along the seams of its 7th and 8th page. Sherlock Moriarty. Good at various types of private investigations. Reasonable prices and strictly adheres to the principles of confidentiality. Resides at Sherwood Burrows 15 Minsk Street. The reason why Klein didn't choose major newspapers like the Tussock Times or the Backland Daily Tribune, that had a readership all across the entirety of the Lowen Kingdom, was due to the fact that his business was temporarily limited to Backland. Furthermore, he didn't wish for a sterling reputation. Therefore, the Backland Bulletin, which was well received locally and had low advertisement fees, became his first choice. After leaving the Backland Bulletin's headquarters, Klein took out a map and followed it to purchase various herb powders and silver slices from various herbal stores, flower stores, jewelry stores, and accessory stores. He did it in preparation for holding a ritual. When items that didn't have any spirituality were involved, most of the materials and mysticism could be purchased from ordinary stores. However, they weren't all under one roof, requiring him to visit many stores to collect them. To do so, Klein spent another £5. The humongous sum of £200 that he withdrew broke below the £100 mark, leaving him only with £92. Spending money is as easy as drinking water. Klein found a small cafeteria nearby and ordered a black pepper steak worth 8 pence. He returned to 15 Minsk Street at 1 in the afternoon, and without rest, he spent his time using slumber flower, dragon blood grass, dark red sandalwood, and mint powders to create holy night powder, a key ingredient needed to create a wall of spirituality. He could only make do with this method until he bought a real silver ritual dagger. Klein speculated that he would have to advance to sequence 7 before he could do away with this restriction. Phew, Miss Justice, Mr. Hanged Man, and the Sun haven't requested for leave yet. The gathering will be held on time today. I wonder what surprises Mr. Hanged Man will bring me, and how many pages of Russell's diary he can provide. Klein laid back on his bed in the bedroom and thought about all sorts of things. To him, a private detective was a career that took into account both money and action. It allowed him to get in touch with people from all walks of life and slowly discover the Beyonder Circle in Backland. From there, he could slowly find clues regarding the secret order. Of course, if he was lucky, he would even be able to figure out the sequence 7 which corresponded to the clown through a particular circle of Beyonders and buy the corresponding potion formula and main ingredients. As for Ince Zangwill's whereabouts, Klein temporarily chose not to take the initiative to seek him out. He might even avoid him a little. However, if he were to accidentally discover this enemy of his, without exposing himself, he wouldn't mind doing a good deed and sending an anonymous letter to the Church of the Evernight Goddess. A private detective's income can, at most, support a middle-class standard of living. If I want enough money to buy the potion formula and Beyonder materials, it will either depend on Miss Justice, or it will be through investments with the remaining £100 that I have left in my anonymous account. Yes, I can't touch the £92 that I have for the time being. Perhaps I wouldn't be having any income for some time. With this in mind, Klein suddenly sat up. He came to the first floor and began reading the various newspapers he bought in passing. These newspapers often carried news about what had been invented and required investments, or how someone wished to form a joint venture with others to do a particular business. Klein relied on his knowledge from Earth and his understanding of this era to carefully sift through the projects. Unfortunately, none of the ones on the papers today were reliable. At 3:15, he returned to his bedroom, locked the door, drew the curtains, and used holy night powder to create a wall of spirituality. Klein took 4 steps counterclockwise and arrived above the gray fog. He sat in the high-back chair belonging to the Fool before extending his spirituality and touching the crimson star that symbolized the sun as if he was responding to a prayer. This is one of the few things in my new life that hasn't changed, he suddenly sighed. In an area outside of the City of Silver, in a grayish-black tower that was half collapsed, 9 members of a patrol squad were gathered around a blazing bonfire, chatting about their experiences in the past few days. There were also a few other team members guarding the perimeter, prepared for any possible attacks that might break out from the darkness. Many of the City of Silver's Beyonders had used their blood to teach them a lesson. At all times, never let your guard down. The monsters in the darkness could very well be right behind you. On a night when the frequency of lightning was very low, it was necessary to keep the flames burning and the light shining. Once they were completely enveloped in darkness, it wasn't impossible for them to all disappear. No one could say for sure just what terrible things would happen in total darkness, because reality had broken the limits of their imagination time and time again. Derek Berg remained reserved and silent as he quietly listened to his companions reminiscing about the monster they had encountered before. It was a humanoid monster with eyes covering its entire body. In order to finish off the monster, their patrolling team suffered a heavy price with 5 injured, and 2 of them severely injured. Suddenly, Derek's vision blurred, and he felt himself being enveloped in a thick gray mist. In an inexplicably faraway place, in the depths of the gray fog, a blurry figure sat on an ancient high-back chair, looking down at him. Prepare for the gathering. The Fool's voice echoed in Derek's ears, but none of his teammates were aware of it. After withdrawing his gaze and observing the area for more than 10 seconds, Derek moved to the very edge of the fire, leaned against the broken wall, and pretended to be asleep. Ever since he found out that the members of the 6-member council and Elder Lovia were unable to discover the existence of Mr. Fool, he gradually believed that as long as he didn't carelessly reveal any clues, he would be able to quietly attend the Tarot Club's gathering above the grey fog even under the gaze of others. Backland, Empress Borough. Using the excuse that she was tired, Audrey returned to her bedroom. She curbed her excitement and didn't pace back and forth. Instead, she sat quietly on the bed, waiting for Mr. Fool's summoning. Father was busy communicating with the other members of Parliament about the proposed bill, and the Beyonder Guard isn't tailing me constantly. Thank you, Goddess. My life has finally returned to normal. 2 weeks have passed. Mr. Hanged Man must have prepared the pituitary gland of a mature rainbow salamander. I'm about to advance to sequence 8. Audrey thought with sparkling eyes. To her, this was even more exciting and worth looking forward to than the £30,000 bounty and the large plantation worth at least £8,000. Finally, she saw the familiar illusory crimson surge towards her like a tidal wave, drowning her. On an ancient-looking sailboat, Alger Wilson locked the door to the captain's cabin and sat behind a sextant and the ship logs. He kept memorizing the contents of the thick stack of sheets in front of him. After the investigations, he left the bustle of Backland without any qualms after being rewarded by the upper echelons and returned to the sea, carrying a batch of secretly copied Russell diary pages. After digesting the seafarer potion, I'll be able to advance normally. My contributions are enough for me to trade for the formula and ingredients. However, this will expose the fact that I know the acting method. There are advantages and disadvantages. Alger shook his head, suddenly distracted. At that moment, he felt the summoning of the fool. His mind suddenly recalled the face of Rear Admiral Hurricane Kilongos, whose flesh and blood quickly rotted as pieces of his face peeled off. Alger instinctively lowered his head, allowing the crimson tide to engulf him. Above the grey fog, inside the palace that looked like a giant's residence. Having activated his spirit vision, Klein examined Justice, the Hanged Man, and the Sun to confirm their current states. Audrey was about to happily greet everyone when she suddenly saw the Hanged Man gesturing to her before rushing to speak before her. Mr. Fool, I've obtained 19 pages of Russell's diary this time. Here, I must thank you for sending your adorer to help me get rid of Kilongos. These diary pages will be the compensation I should pay. 19 pages? Not bad. Klein didn't talk much about the adorer as he smiled faintly. That is the principle of equivalent exchange. As expected of Mr. Fool. A pirate admiral with a mystical item was nothing to him, from the looks of it. I don't have to mention my claiming of the bounty. I wonder how many high-sequence Beyonders Mr. Fool has as his adorers. Audrey had begun to use the word he, him, or his to refer to the fool without realizing it. Upon hearing the fool's answer, Alger said humbly, the limit of my current memory is 6 pages. Please allow me to give them to you over separate occasions. No problem. Klein, who was surrounded by thick grey fog, nodded gently. The son Derek looked at the pages that appeared before the Hanged Man and was very curious about the contents of the diary. With his previous experiences, he believed that the items that Mr. Fool was interested in definitely contained many mysteries. He looked at Miss Justice, and when he saw that she didn't have the impulse to ask, he cautiously maintained his silence. Soon, the 6 pages of the diary were complete and came into Klein's hands. Audrey and the others began to wait quietly. They were already used to such things. Klein looked down and read the first page, the 16th of December. I managed to contact the pathetic fellow who's trapped in the storm and was lost in the darkness. Finally, there's a follow-up to one of the previous pages of the diary. Klein was delighted, and he became more focused. He called himself Mr. Door and tried to teach me a complicated and difficult ritual. He wanted me to help him return to the real world and promised to fulfill 3 of my requests. Does he think I'm stupid? I've lived for more than 60 years over my 2 lives. Does he think I can't tell that this is the usual manipulation done by evil gods and devils? But the history of the 4th epoch that he described was truly interesting. Mr. Door. This naming style is very similar to mine. I wonder what was the real name of this pathetic fellow who was lost and trapped in the deep darkness amidst the storms is, and what his sequence is. Or rather, just as Emperor Russell had guessed, he's one of the evil gods or devils. Klein let out a silent chuckle which was mixed with ridicule and self-deprecating humor. He was also interested in the history of the 4th epoch. I know of the most famous War of the 4 Emperors in the 4th epoch, but the specific details and the main figures involved are limited to the information spread by the major churches. For example, the Dark Emperor, of the Solomon Empire. It wasn't until today that this so-called Mr. Door finally answered my questions by letting me know who the remaining 3 emperors are. The half-insane Blood Emperor of the Tudor dynasty, the Night Emperor of the Trunsost Empire, and the Emperor of the Underworld of the Southern Continent, also known as Death. According to Mr. Door's description, in this war that changed the situation of the entire world, the Dark Emperor, Blood Emperor and Night Emperor fell one after another. The Emperor of the Underworld reaped the greatest benefits. Having said that, Mr. Door added with profound significance that after over a century of digestion, Death went mad, but he also became stronger. Therefore, Death teamed up with the primordial demoness and brought about a pale disaster for the northern continent. Of course, this isn't something he witnessed personally, but rather something that he hears when he comes close to the real world every month. Death went mad, but also became stronger. Even deities can go mad? What a horrifying sentence. However, this also confirms my guess. Before the 5th epoch, those deities would often descend into the real world, directly interfering with the situation in the northern and southern continents. They might even personally appear just like Death. I asked Mr. Door if he had participated in the War of the 4 Emperors. If so, what role did he play? And what was the position the seven deities maintained in this war? What role did they play? Mr. Dorr didn't answer my question. He only said in a teasing manner that the number of preeminent mighty figures in the fourth epic far exceeds my imagination. In addition, he also mentioned two laws, one is the law of Beyander characteristics indestructibility, and the other is the law of similar sequence Beyander characteristics conservation, which is consistent with certain things that I have learned from that most secret and ancient organization, and also from some of the phenomena I have observed. Hey, this can lead to many interesting conclusions, making many explanations take on other forms, making one's mind tremble in horror. For example, when there are too many high-sequence beyonders in the same sequence pathway, the low-sequence beyonders would reduce, and vice versa. The Beyander characteristics had been fixed at the source. It will not increase or decrease. Does this mean that there really is a God who created all the deities, an omnipotent and omniscient God, and everything originated from him? This was the longest Roussel diary that Klein had ever seen. It took up 2 full pages, and one could imagine that it originally came on a double-sided page. It only became 2 separate pages after repeated copying. That's a lot of information. Klein sighed silently. As a history student who had graduated normally, he had always believed that the Solomon Empire, the Tudor dynasty, and the Trunsost Empire came one after the other in a line, with a certain degree of restoration before a new political outcome was established. To his surprise, the War of the Four Emperors described by Mr. Dorr clearly and unambiguously revealed one thing: all 3 empires had existed at the same time. If this were true, then it would really overturn most of the current research on the fourth epoch in the field of history. Klein suddenly thought of the original Klein, who was filled with interest towards archaeology and the history regarding the fourth epoch. Today, I've helped him achieve his wish. I wonder if Death had already become a true deity during the War of the Four Emperors. It's hard to determine according to Mr. Dorr's descriptions. I can only first assume that the Emperor of the Underworld, who had obtained benefits from the War of the Four Emperors, had broken through his limits and become a deity, but he also went mad as a result. To have a deity go mad was truly terrifying. Just thinking about the details makes one tremble from the bottom of their heart. It's no wonder that the knowledgeable Emperor Roussel would use the word horrifying to describe this matter. Could it be that the so-called evil gods were crazy orthodox deities? Would that mean that there might only be evil gods left in this world one day? Man, does this mean that the end of days cannot be stopped? Klein smiled to hide the growing solemnity of his emotions. He felt that the future he imagined was filled with a dark gray hue. At the same time, he raised his evaluation of the Dark Emperor, Blood Emperor, and Night Emperor, believing them to be the preeminent mighty figures who were close to being deities. Perhaps that means sequence 1 is the peak existence of a single pathway. According to this logic, for Dark Emperor to live for centuries or over a millennium wouldn't be unacceptable. That would explain the original Klein's confusion. He had obtained contradictory findings from the content recorded in the Antigonus family's notebook with his own mentor's viewpoint. He believed that the Dark Emperor was the common name used by every emperor of the Solomon Empire. Perhaps the Dark Emperor had always been the same Dark Emperor. Of course, other possibilities cannot be eliminated. For example, they could have been replaced 2 or 3 times, but is the name of that pathway's sequence 1, Dark Emperor? I wonder who Mr. Dorr is in the history of the fourth epoch. Emperor Roussel didn't go into detail when describing his erroneous experiments and accidental coincidences, making it impossible for me to even try to converse with that Mr. Dorr. The laws of Beyander characteristics indestructibility and similar sequence Beyander characteristics conservation shares the same description as the one used by the captain. Perhaps the term he used came from Emperor Roussel. According to the 2 laws described by Mr. Gate, we can indeed deduce a lot of interesting speculations. For example, with there being so many holy artifacts and high-sequence Beyonders in the 7 churches, there shouldn't be many low-sequence Beyonders. But this contradicts reality, and the only reasonable explanation is an additional gift from the deities? For example, is the destruction of the nation of the Evernite due to the conservation of characteristics, that the mere possession of resources causes it to be in trouble? Or could it be said that their existence seriously weakens the potency of the Evernite pathway and threatens the position of the goddess? For example, theoretically speaking, certain sealed artifacts could also be used as the main ingredients for potion materials, or they can even be considered equivalent to potions. Of course, the prerequisite is to remove all latent dangers and madness. No wonder the documents that were unearthed called the fourth epoch, the epoch of the gods. So it turns out that in this epoch, there are many records of deities descending. Then what caused them to stop coming, to the point of there not being any revelations? If it wasn't for the fact that Beyonders receive responses from ritualistic magic, perhaps many of them would have doubted the existence of the deities. Many ideas came to Klein suddenly as he felt that he had delved deeper into the realm of mysticism in this Beyonder world. He flipped through the next 4 pages and was disappointed to realize that they were no longer related to Mr. Dorr. His ability as a clown allowed him to conceal his emotions well, and coupled with the grey fog's obstruction, even Audrey, who was secretly observing him, didn't notice anything amiss. He gathered his chaotic thoughts and started reading the 3rd page of the diary, the 10th of September. I've endured it for a long time, but I still can't help but complain a little. I must have had F King sh*T for brains to chose the Savon path, right? Of course, this has indeed allowed me to develop my greatest advantage, allowing the Church to attach great importance to me. But the problem is that the first few sequences lack any Beyonder powers needed for combat. I can only make do by relying on mystical items and rely way too much on external items. For example, Sequence 9 Savon only has extraordinary abilities in memory, learning, and practical skills. For example, Sequence 8 Archaeologist gains a strong physique and corresponding ancient knowledge, and they can only barely apply some ritualistic magic. For example, Sequence 7 Appraiser, whose ability is to quickly identify mystical objects, allowing them to avoid hidden dangers to the greatest extent. For example, Sequence 6 Artisan, who can produce machinery wonder but not very powerful Beyonder objects. Apart from that, one standard in ritualistic magic will be enhanced. It's no wonder its modern name is Machinery Specialist. Comparatively speaking, the Sequence 7 Warlock and Sequence 6 Scrolls Professor of the Mystery Prior pathway are sufficiently tempting. It would be great if only the Church has the complete sequence and that the Hidden Sage doesn't exist. However, I finally received some good news. After I advance again, I'll gain Beyonder powers, combat powers that I can call my own. Sequence 5 Astromancer. Its modern name scares me a little. It's actually called Astronomer. Am I going to end up as an all-powerful mad scientist? Heavens have mercy on me. I was only a second-tier student at the college entrance examination. It had to be said that Emperor Russell had a strange talent for making jokes. Even the recently dispirited Klein couldn't help but twitch his mouth, wishing to light a candle for this senior. Study hard and improve by the day is indeed a wise saying. He lampooned and remembered the unique trait of the Church of the God of Steam and Machinery. They lacked Beyonder powers when it came to combat, but they were good at making and using items. After flipping to the 3rd page of the diary, Klein continued reading. The 2nd of June, the kingdom has created chaos, again and again, instigating wars without being able to completely destroy the Faesac Empire, the Loan Kingdom, and the Phaenopotter Kingdom. As such, the kingdom has no choice but to shoulder huge debts, and its economy is on the verge of collapse. From my observations, the people, merchants, and soldiers are very dissatisfied. The riots are just lacking a spark. This is my chance. But I have to be very careful. The Sauron family has witnessed the history of the 4th epoch and is an ancient family with a high possibility of having high-sequence Beyonders. I need the support of the Church, as well as gain a tacit agreement with the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun. I can't appear immediately. First, I'll let the rebels destroy order before I end it all as a protector. Consul Russell Gustav. I like that name. June 3rd. After discussing with Edwards and the others, I gave up on the idea of reaching a tacit understanding with the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun. This might very well reveal my true intentions, making the Sauron family and the ancient nobles who support them aware of them in advance and carry out a direct approach. That would make matters extremely difficult and dangerous. It's a pity that Grimm died in the Sea of Fog. He was the smartest among us. Descend into chaos. Descend. Only with everything in chaos will I get the chance to fish in troubled waters. Only when the Sauron family is incapable of handling this situation will the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun reluctantly acknowledge me. Perhaps I should give some help to those rebels, but how should I conceal myself so that no one would notice? June 4th, Zaratul from the Secret Order came to visit me in incognito very suddenly. Ellipsis. And then? Klein was just feeling intrigued over the reason why Zaratul, leader of the Secret Order, would seek Russell on the eve of the rebellion and coup d'état when he realized that the 2 subsequent pages had nothing to do with it. This made him feel a sense of irrepressible anger. Although the 3 diary pages didn't provide very detailed descriptions, with rather straightforward accounts from Russell, Klein could still feel the famous turmoil in Intis that happened in 1173, more than 100 years ago. The outcome was clearly recorded in history textbooks. As a colonel, Republic quashed the rebellion and enacted political changes. The Intis kingdom was transformed into a republic, with him acting as a self-appointed consul. In the following 19 years, he reformed the penal code, encouraged inventions, and protected the Industrial Revolution. He greatly increased the country's strength and fought wars both north and south, making Lemberg, Maassen, Seeger, and other countries protectorates under the Intis Republic. He also made the three mighty countries on the northern continent, the Faesac Empire, the Loan Kingdom, and the Fanapoder Kingdom, bow their heads. At the end of 1192, almost 20 years after his appointment as consul, Roussel converted the republic into an empire, declaring himself Caesar. Less than 6 years later, he perished in the White Maple Palace, ending the fifth epoch's most legendary piece of history to date. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that there was more to Roussel's death than what appeared on the surface. It was just like how this famous historical event definitely had power struggles amongst Beyonders behind it, and that a Beyonder faction had leveled the situation, unlike the descriptions in textbooks. As expected, one of the so-called four horsemen of the apocalypse, Grimm, died in the Sea of Fog. In a previous diary page, Roussel had written that there was something wrong with this horseman. It seems to have something to do with the tiny island where they discovered many extraordinary beings. Not only was it a fortuitous encounter, but it was also a dangerous one. Klein thought of a previous entry and turned to the fifth page, feeling emotional. The contents of this page are of little value. They consist of Roussel's comments after drinking an 1128 Ormir red wine, the disillusion of finding the woman who had gained his adoration in his youth to be aged and out of shape, as well as a degenerate summary of a certain period when he was addicted to playing cards. The sixth page was about the same as the first one, with accounts of his daily life. However, the last one made Klein's eyes light up. The 8th of April, I have to send someone to investigate the secret order to get more information. I can't repeat my passiveness from before. I can't let Zaradul lead me by the nose anymore. So, did you discover anything, Comrade Roussel? Since Klein couldn't find the rest of the information, he could only force himself to calm down and wait for the next gathering when the hanged man would hand over another 6 pages. He knew that an investigation from over 100 years ago was unlikely to help him find any clues related to the Secret Order Association. After all, over such a long period of time, other than the special ones, many of the high-sequence Beyonders would have already died of old age, not to mention the middle or low-level members. However, Klein believed that this would help him obtain inspiration and grasp the precise identity and activity patterns that the Secret Order often used. Putting down the 6 diary pages, Klein tapped his right index finger on the edge of the long bronze table, slowly moving his gaze from Miss Justice to the hanged man, and then to the sun. Right, in the diary just now, there was a line Emperor Roussel described. God who created all the deities, an omnipotent and omniscient God. This is very similar to the customs of the City of Silver. Where did he hear this from? Could it be from that most ancient and secret organization which controls the world from behind the scenes? This organization was established before the Forsaken Land of the Gods was forsaken? Suddenly, Klein had a new idea. He said with a low and gentle smile, Roussel mentioned some hidden history in his diary, and mentioned some simple general knowledge. The latter reminded me of something that I don't recall informing you all. Audrey suddenly fell into a trance. She immediately turned her body around and looked at the very top of the ancient long table in pleasant surprise. Mr. Fool is taking the initiative to mention the contents of Roussel's diary? What would it say? She was so excited and thrilled that she completely forgot that she was a spectator. Compared to her, the hanged man, Alger, was much more composed. However, the subconscious straightening of his back heartlessly betrayed him. Only the son, Derek, had always believed that the items of interest to Mr. Fool contained many mysteries, but he didn't know anything about Emperor Roussel and didn't know what this name represented in the northern continent. Thus, he just found it difficult to hide his curiosity and didn't reveal any unusual behavior. Mr. Fool, did Emperor Roussel mention some general knowledge? I'm willing to pay for this information, Audrey couldn't help but say. However, I want it to be communicated to me privately. She added silently in her heart. Klein chuckled and said, there's no need. This is very simple general knowledge. After reading this part of the diary, as the summoner of the Tarot Club, I feel it's necessary to let all of you know this. Of course, I'm very certain that some of you are already aware of this. He was mainly referring to the sun. The City of Silver had a history of 2 to 3,000 years, so it was impossible for them to not discover the law of Beyonder characteristics indestructibility. Moreover, they were in a relatively extreme environment. Even if the surrounding areas had no lack of monsters in the darkness, there would still be times when they failed to obtain the corresponding materials. In order to pass on their heritage, in order for their city to continue on, using the Beyonder characteristics of the remains of their predecessors to create a potion wasn't particularly unacceptable. To them, this was perhaps a sacred and glorious ceremony. Of course, Klein could see from a previous exchange that the hanged man knew something. It's a pity that Miss Justice cannot always be made to pay in gold pounds and transfer the money to my adorers. My adorer can't appear any less impressive. I mustn't destroy the image of the powerful man that Mr. Azek has created. Yes, I'll give it a try when I have the chance. After all, no matter how powerful a being is, they'll have subordinates that run errands. For instance, the Evernight goddess is sleepless. No one would ever suspect that the Evernight goddess isn't a true deity just because the low-level Nighthawks are weak. Klein sighed silently. Thank you very much. Mr. Fool, you are just too generous. Audrey replied in joy. She was originally feeling 3 seconds of regret for the coarse action of using cash to purchase the information. Klein stopped rapping the table and described with a calm voice, the first piece of general knowledge. Law of Beyonder characteristics indestructibility. The characteristics of a Beyonder is never destroyed or reduced. It's only passed from one carrier to the next. Without realizing it, I used Captain's tone. Klein's lips subconsciously curled upwards. It cannot be destroyed or reduced. It just transfers from one carrier to another. Audrey ruminated over Mr. Fool's description, feeling that there was too much meaning in that simple sentence. Her emerald green eyes turned, and when she saw that neither the hanged man nor the sun showed any signs of surprise or contemplation, she immediately understood that these two members of the Tarot Club had long known of this law. Only I didn't know, she thought, feeling somewhat aggrieved, but she quickly began to praise Mr. Fool for his kindness. At this point, Klein added, after a rampager dies, they will leave behind an item of Beyonder characteristics. It could be the main ingredient, or it could be a mystical artifact that requires sealing. An ordinary Beyonder's death results in similar results. However, the item left behind will be equivalent to the corresponding potion without the supplementary ingredients. Of course, the item alone will contain Beyonder powers. They can be used as a half-mystical object. The plain and indifferent words instantly echoed in Audrey's mind. Layers stacked upon layers and, bit by bit, it eventually reached a crescendo. Audrey thought of cannibalism and the question, would a sequence pathway be severed if the source of Beyonder materials ceased to exist? She had asked the hanged man previously came to mind. Now, she knew the answer, but she would have rather not heard it. She felt like she was having a nightmare. How can it be so cruel? Why is it so dark? Audrey had previously seen some bad situations that involved Beyonders, but those situations were only caused by a person's own perverse and evil nature. For example, Mr. A or Kilongos. They didn't affect her yearning and love for mysticism and the Beyonder world. However, this time, she discovered that the mystical world was filled with grayness and darkness. Wake up, Audrey, you can't be naive. Consider that the cruelty and darkness described by Mr. Fool are predictable. Since he had chosen this path, he had to bravely walk down it. Audrey consoled herself, easing her mood a little. She saw that the hanged man and the sun were making only habitual movements and appeared to understand what had just been said. HMPH. Mr. Hanged Man is terrible. He even wanted to use this information as an exchange previously. This information is indeed worth a lot and is quite important, but it's only a simple piece of general knowledge to us and Mr. Fool. Audrey suddenly wanted to laugh a little. Her mood began to improve, and she slowly pushed all the extreme examples that she had just thought of aside. Klein wasn't surprised by the three members' reaction. He continued in a calm tone, the second piece of general knowledge, Law of Similar Sequence Beyonder Characteristics Conservation. Law of Similar Sequence Beyonder Characteristics Conservation. The hanged man slightly changed his sitting posture. He felt that he understood something, but he was unable to fully understand what this law represented and what it consisted of. Justice and the Sun shared the same feelings as he did. They were unable to directly understand the true meaning behind this law. Why similar sequence? Alger couldn't help asking. Klein smiled and replied, what do you wish to pay for the answer? One of the ideas he had was that general knowledge was free, but any explanation required a fee. This both matched his status and didn't waste the information. Free things cost the most. Report chapter. If the fool had simply mentioned that there was some simple general knowledge contained in Russell's diary, the hanged man, Alger, wouldn't necessarily be determined to pay the price for the answer, partly because the description of it being simple killed his curiosity. Another aspect stemmed from his constant wariness against making trades with the fool, as it reminded him of the examples when deals were made with evil gods and devils. But now that he knew the so-called contents of simple general knowledge, his interest was piqued. Yet, he was unable to understand parts of the description, much less gain any actual or deep grasp of the concept. Therefore, he couldn't hold back his urges to ask in absolute reverence, "Mr. Fool, what kind of payment do you want?" "Yes, yes." Justice Audrey nodded her head nearly indiscernibly but very frequently, indicating that this was something she wanted to ask as well. Although the son Derek remained silent and didn't make any additional body gestures, the look he gave to the fool explained everything. Klein, who was waiting for such a response, smiled and said, "Information regarding the secret order." The secret order. The hanged man Alger muttered to himself. He wasn't unfamiliar with this term. He had once received payment for explaining to Miss Justice about many secret organizations, including the secret order. Audrey and Derek both frowned subconsciously. The former's only understanding of the secret order was limited to what the hanged man had described. And the latter had never even heard of such an organization. Klein had long anticipated what the son would feel, but he wasn't surprised. According to his conjecture, the area where the City of Silver was located should have been a part of the third epoch after the appearance of the first blasphemy slate and before the appearance of the second blasphemy slate. It was even possible that it was the direct catalyst or manifestation of the cataclysm. The Zaradil family had only stepped onto the stage of history in the fourth epoch, and the secret order was created in the latter half of the fourth epoch. There was no way both entities could have existed in the same period. It would surprise Klein if the son were to know about the secret order. He would then have to overturn some of his speculations, reconstruct his knowledge of the City of Silver, the Forsaken Land of the Gods, and the Zaradil family. After nearly 20 seconds of silence, Alger looked at the fool in the grey fog, deliberated his words and said, "I will accept this request and help you gather information regarding the secret order. Can you make payment in advance?" It wasn't surprising that a suspected deity was interested in an ancient and secret organization. Therefore, Alger wasn't puzzled about it. More importantly, after many gatherings, he had a guess in his mind, which was that Mr. Fool's state wasn't perfect, that he might be in a predicament, that all his attempts and the actions of his adorers on the northern and southern continents were to help him break free from his confines. This might even be related to the huge secret of why the seven deities no longer descend upon the real world after the fourth epoch. A thought flashed through Alger's mind, and he shuddered as he felt himself entering the realm of the gods. Upon hearing the hanged man's request, Klein leaned back in his chair and nodded. "No problem. If the information you have collected exceeds the value of the answer, I will provide you with further compensation. As for the circumstances in which the value of the answer was lacking, it is naturally up to the esteemed Mr. Fool to decide. If he has the ability to make the additional payment, so be it. If not, forget it." Klein silently added. Justice Audrey's eyes lit up all of a sudden. She raised her hand and said, "I want to partake in this deal." Klein laughed and replied, "Sure." Frankly speaking, his main target was Miss Justice because she was a local of Backland and she had mixed herself into several Beander circles. Her access to information in the Land of Hope far exceeded his, considering it was his first time in the capital. She was also more informed than the hanged man who was out at sea most of the time. According to the earlier revelation he received from his divination, Klein believed that the clues related to the secret order would appear in Backland and not anywhere else. The son Derek listened quietly and after some thought, said, "I'm willing to use the payment I reserved and exchange it for the answer." In the previous three-way deal, he had traded the Sequence 8 Telepathus formula for Sequence 9 Bard. Klein had promised to compensate him, and his choice at the time had been to save it up and prepare for the subsequent potion formulas and main ingredients. Klein nodded his head and gave an explanation that he had long prepared. The so-called similar sequence refers to how high sequence beyonders are exchangeable with other pathways. Let me give an example. The Death Pathways Sequence 5, Gatekeeper, can not only be advanced normally, but one can also choose the Giant Pathway, which is the Gatekeeper Pathways Sequence 4, Demon Hunter. This won't lead to the danger of losing control, nor will it accumulate madness. It's different from taking the wrong potion. Of course, if it's not a similar sequence, a semi-deranged state is the best result. Exchangeable? Audrey blurted out, surprised and delighted. She was surprised that sequence pathways weren't completely fixed, that they didn't need to follow the original path all the way. The price of switching wasn't being semi-deranged and never to advance again. Within the 22 divine pathways, there were special circumstances and sequences which were similar. And what delighted her was that she had another chance to choose again in the future. It was just like being able to select something that caught her interest at Philip's department store. It was a wonderful experience. So that's how it is. Alger silently muttered to himself, suddenly feeling like he had understood several things at once, and he had resolved many of the doubts accumulated in his past experiences. This information is way too valuable. As expected of Mr. Fool. So-called simple general knowledge is enough to shock and awe most low-sequence beyonders and benefit them immensely. He sighed inwardly. Derek the son was a little disappointed because he had no intention of changing sequences. He wanted to be the sun that lit up the darkness and dispelled the curse. However, he quickly recalled an incident that happened in the City of Silver. The former chief, a powerhouse who had the greatest possibility of breaking past the limitations of Demon Hunter, had built a mausoleum for himself and went deep inside, making it his home. Afterwards, he appeared less and less, until the main door of the mausoleum could no longer be opened. Back then, the citizens of the City of Silver all believed that a problem had arisen during the chief's advancement and that he had gone mad, to the point of being close to losing control. He was believed to have finished himself off. Now, combined with the description from the fool, the son suddenly thought of another possibility. That chief might have been attempting to advance in sequence through a similar pathway. In one of his explorations deep into the darkness, he had acquired the corresponding formula for the death pathway, and the mausoleum might have been a special requirement. But in the end, he still failed? But why didn't he turn into a monster? What did he encounter in that dark mausoleum? The City of Silver doesn't have the subsequent sequence potion formulas after Demon Hunter? As these thoughts crossed his mind, Derek was suddenly jolted back to his senses by Miss Justice's reserved voice. Mr. Fool, may I ask what other pathways are exchangeable with the Spectator Sequencer pathway? Sequence 4 Demon Hunter sounds pretty good. That's very suitable for me, very suitable for Justice. Audrey admired the first high sequence name that she knew. I want to know too. Klein was tempted to answer Miss Justice's question in such a manner. Before he could say anything, Audrey added in a faltering tone, I can pay for the answer to this question. How many gold pounds do you think is enough? I believe that your adorer will need a certain amount of funds for their activities. Having said that, she recalled how Mr. Fool's adorer had easily finished Pirate Admiral Kilongos, who possessed creeping hunger. Clearly, he was a high-sequence Beyander, so she nearly said, I apologize. Mr. Fool, treat it as though I never said a thing. However, since she had already asked, she couldn't back down. Come on, Audrey, perhaps the fool has a weaker adorer? Audrey quietly bit at her lips, silently encouraging herself. Gold pounds? Klein thought about it seriously and said, we'll make the transaction after enough information about the secret order is gathered. As he spoke, he recalled his informant in the Psychology Alchemists, Daxter Guderian. Captain and Sigh. Daxter's identity as an informant can no longer be verified. I wonder if it's a tragedy or a comedy. It's a pity that I can no longer contact him anymore. Otherwise, it would be the most convenient way to obtain the information regarding the Spectator pathway from him. Klein smirked. All right, Audrey answered happily. The conversation between the two made the Hanged Man, who was about to ask a similar question, shut his mouth. He left it until he had gathered enough information on the secret order. After a brief silence, Audrey turned her head to look at Mr. Fool and raised her hand very slightly. After receiving a nod of confirmation, she turned to the member opposite her and asked with a sense of anticipation, Mr. Hanged Man, my tip allowed you to finish Rear Admiral Hurricane. Have you prepared the complete pituitary gland of a mature rainbow salamander? That's one of the reasons why I returned to the sea. Alger nodded gently and said, I've gotten the Beyander material you wanted. But how should I give it to you? How should it be given to me? Audrey froze for a moment as she lost herself in thought. It's impossible to just give my address. Nor can I go through Zeo and Furs. That will reveal the fact that I'm a Beyander. It's not impossible. Emperor Russell once said that when we should choose the lesser of two evils. At that moment, Klein's heart stirred. He lightly tapped the edge of the long table and smiled. Sir, are you willing to cooperate with me in making an attempt regarding this matter? Attempt? Justice was instantly thrilled as she nodded her, acting reserved and elegant. I'm very willing to cooperate. As a spectator, she clearly remembered that Mr. Fool had only used the word attempt on two things. The first time involved bringing her and the Hanged Man into this mysterious space, and the second time was when they were given an honorary name so that they could attempt to make a prayer. And the outcome was sufficiently successful, revealing his true nature. What would it be this time? It really is something to look forward to. Audrey restrained her impatience and tried her best to behave as a qualified spectator. Attempt. Alger suddenly tensed up, viewing the fool's proposal with utmost wariness. What does he want to do? What is his true purpose? Is this good or bad for me? One by one, thoughts popped up in his mind. The rapidly rotting appearance of Rear Admiral Hurricane Kilongos surfaced in Alger's mind. Finally, he lowered his head and respectfully replied, "Your wish is my wish." Beside him, Derek looked at the Hanged Man, and then at Justice, wondering why they were so sensitive to this so-called attempt. Klein lightly tapped his fingers on the edge of the long bronze table and smiled. This attempt will make your transaction easier and safer, and it will definitely be sufficiently confidential. He turned his head to the side and looked at the Hanged Man. He said with a moderate pace, "Do you remember the sacrificial ritual described by the sun?" Klein had deliberately mentioned it to show how open he was. It made it difficult for the members of the Tarot Club to imagine that the sacrificial ceremony he was about to provide had actually first been obtained from the sun and that he had gone through all that time and effort back then to trick the sun out of a template sacrificial ritual. "I remember. I do come into contact with such things usually," Alger answered truthfully, but his heart was throbbing. Since the Orthodox gods rarely responded to similar rituals, the word sacrifice had often been equated to evil gods and devils in the fifth epoch. Thinking about how this could lead to a terrifying outcome, the Hanged Man felt as if he was walking at the edge of the abyss. If he wasn't careful, he would fall in, only to be eroded and devoured. Klein followed his plans and didn't provide further explanations. He nodded slightly and said, "My idea is for you to sacrifice the Beyonder material to me through the ritual and I'll bestow them to Miss Justice. A transaction like this will be beneficial for both of you." "That can be done?" Audrey was instantly dumbfounded. She felt that this exceeded the limits of her imagination. But she very quickly came to her senses and understood the advantages of this method and the true nature of a deity hidden behind this simple act. "Mr. Fool is great. As expected, our Tarot Club will be different from the other secret organizations. We'll use the method of deities to exchange for material goods and ingredients." Audrey almost said, "Praise the lady," in her mind out of habit, but in the end, she said, "Praise Mr. Fool," instead. Alger turned even warier as he entered a state of calm thoughts. "Honorable Mr. Fool, what do I need to do?" He tried to figure out the true purpose of the Fool from the process of the sacrificial ritual. Klein lightly pressed his right hand and said, "Like I said, this is only an attempt. It might not succeed, so it will need your cooperation. First of all, prepare an altar. There's no need to make it too complicated. It can be very simple and crude. The only requirement is to engrave or draw this symbol." As he spoke, a screen of light appeared in front of him. On it was the symbol of the hidden, pupil-less eye, and the mysterious symbol of the partial contorted lines, the same symbol on the back of the Fool's chair. After previous experiments without using materials with spirituality, Klein was certain that the sacrificial ceremony he designed could create an illusory gate above the gray fog, similar to the door of summoning. However, his strength alone couldn't construct a stable channel, and he could only use the uniqueness of the mysterious space above the gray fog to complete the sacrifice. Therefore, he was 90% confident that the ceremony would be successful. The only problem was if an ordinary passageway could be constructed using ordinary materials that contain spirituality, or did it need to be Beyonder materials as well as a sufficient number of them. "I'll let Miss Justice and Mr. Hanged Man bear the cost of this experiment." In any case, they knew from the very beginning that the Tarot Club was a product of an attempt. It can be foreseen that there would be other attempts subsequently, and failure is inevitable. Even deities are no exception. Klein decided to transfer the costs. As the Hanged Man, Justice, and the Sun were attempting to memorize the symbol, Klein chuckled. "If you forget, you can pray to me, and then you can remember." "All right," Audrey answered happily. With Mr. Fool, rituals aren't tedious and troublesome. She thought happily. The Hanged Man nodded in response as Klein continued the description. "Secondly, follow the normal procedure, but there's no need to burn any more additional herbs or apply the holy oil. There's no restriction on time, just chanting my name is enough." Remember, use ancient Hermes or Jotun to recite this piece of prayer. Your devoted servant prays for your attention. I pray for you to take his offerings. I pray for you to open the gates to your kingdom. After you finish chanting, combine the materials that contain spirituality with the natural power created by the incantation, and await my response. If you don't succeed in this step, change from materials containing spirituality to Byander materials, and try again from the beginning. After listening quietly to the procedure, Alger felt that his previous guess was very likely to be the truth. The fool was in a predicament. He offered alluring attempts, making attempts one step at a time, and planned to use himself, Justice, and the sun to slowly break free of the restrictions. In the end, he might even descend into the real world. This was also the true reason why he had initially pulled people into this mysterious space, agreeing to the establishment of the Tarot Club. Even without this previous speculation, Alger believed that he would have come to the same conclusion after hearing of the experimental procedures required after the sacrificial ritual and comparing it with the fool's previous attempts. The only thing that stumped him was the possession of a powerful adorer. Therefore, there was no need for him to use himself, Justice, and the sun. His adorer could make similar attempts. There must be secrets I don't know about yet. The attempts need to be sufficiently secretive. And perhaps his adorer is being watched by certain existences? Alger began connecting the dots. After Klein finished describing the ritual, he asked in a low but gentle voice, the sacrificial ritual needs a specific time. Mr. Hanged Man, when do you plan on making the attempt? This was different from responding to a request which could have a delayed response. The stable passage created by the sacrificial ritual could only exist for a very short period of time, so Klein had to wait above the gray fog ahead of time. The rainbow salamander's pituitary gland is the only Byander material I have with me for the time being. As for materials with spirituality, I do have quite a lot. Mr. Fool, once the gathering ends, I'll immediately attempt the first scenario. If it fails, I'll seek out other Byander materials. Once I obtain anything, I'll inform you by praying to confirm a time, Alger said as he couldn't help but turn his gaze towards Miss Justice. As a spectator, Audrey instantly understood what he meant. She answered without the slightest hesitation, if any additional Byander materials are required, I'll compensate you afterward. Well, I can't guarantee the specific type of material you would want. As expected of the wealthy Miss Justice. The fool, Klein, couldn't help but sigh before chuckling. We have come to an agreement. He looked at Justice and said after some thought, once Mr. Hanged Man's attempt succeeds, I'll inform you of the bestowment ceremony. All right. Audrey was entirely confident with Mr. Fool's abilities. After answering the question, a sudden thought struck her as she realized that the exchange of money could also be done through this method. Of course, this was only if the attempt was a success. I wonder if items without any spirituality would work or not. I'll ask Mr. Fool again after the attempt is successful. Audrey's lips curled as she thought of the beautiful future. With the sacrifice and bestowment topic coming to an end, she deliberated for a few seconds before saying, Mr. Fool, I've found 2 ladies suitable for our tarot club. They're both Byanders and have their own circle and resources in Backland. They're also able to keep a secret and have decent personalities. Are you willing to let them join the gathering? Does Justice want to strengthen her faction within the tarot club? This was the most instinctual thought that Alger had. Derek was very interested in this matter as he looked sideways at Mr. Fool, waiting for his answer in anticipation. Klein appeared to be in a bit of a dilemma. Previously, he had imagined that the members of the Tarot Club wouldn't know each other, and they would then develop their own subordinates, forming a relatively tight and secretive organization. This way, even if a certain member was exposed, captured, or had their spirit channeled, it wouldn't have much of an impact on the Tarot Club. But Miss Justice's description just happened to hit his weak spot. He was hoping to find clues regarding the secret order and Lenivus by acquainting himself with Byanders with different circles and resources in Backland. If it's done through Justice, the person involved would eventually hold back. However, I'm not sure if it's possible to pull them up above the gray fog simply by reciting my name. In order to maintain his image, Klein didn't think too much and instead procrastinated on it. He said calmly, it will require a certain amount of examination. Miss Justice, use a clandestine method that wouldn't expose yourself to let them know of my name to garner interest in them. When Audrey saw that her proposal was about to be accepted, she immediately responded in excitement, yes, Mr. Fool. After a few more exchanges, the gathering came to an end. The sun, the Hanged Man, and Justice returned, while Klein remained in the gray fog, waiting for the sacrifice.